The landscape of northern Britain in the centuries preceding the emergence of the Old North kingdoms was shaped by a complex interplay of indigenous Celtic societies and Roman imperial ambitions. The region that would later become known as Hen Ogledd bore witness to nearly 4 centuries of Roman occupation, during which time the existing tribal structures were both challenged and paradoxically preserved in modified forms that would prove crucial to the post-Roman political landscape. The Brigantes dominated the largest territorial expanse among the northern British tribes, controlling vast swathes of what is now Yorkshire, Lancashire, and parts of the Lake District. Archaeological evidence from settlements like Stanwick in North Yorkshire reveals a sophisticated society with extensive hill forts, some encompassing over 700 acres, protected by multiple ramparts and defensive ditches. The Brigantian capital at Isurium Brigantum, modern Aldborough, developed from an earlier native settlement into a substantial Romano-British town with tessellated pavements, hypocaust heating systems, and a forum complex that rivaled those found in southern Britain. The tribal confederation's internal politics proved as complex as their territorial holdings. Queen Cartimandua's rule during the mid-1st century AD demonstrated the sophisticated political structures that existed among the Brigantes, with evidence suggesting a system of sub-chiefs governing discrete territories under her overall authority. Her alliance with Rome, formalised through a client-king relationship, allowed the Brigantes to maintain considerable autonomy while benefiting from Roman protection and trade networks. The subsequent civil war between Cartimandua and her consort Venutius revealed deep factional divisions within Brigantian society, with archaeological evidence from sites like Ingleborough showing signs of hasty fortification and conflict during this period. North of the Brigantes, the Votadini occupied the coastal regions from the Firth of Forth to the River Tweed, establishing their primary stronghold at Traprain Law in East Lothian. This massive hill fort, rising 724 feet above sea level, shows continuous occupation from the Bronze Age through the Roman period and beyond. Excavations have revealed a settlement covering 40 acres at its peak, with evidence of metalworking, pottery production, and extensive trade connections, reaching as far as the Mediterranean. The famous Traprain Law treasure, discovered in 1919, consisted of over 100 pieces of late Roman silver, much of it deliberately hacked and folded, suggesting either ritual deposition or preparation for melting down into ingots for trade. The Votadini's relationship with Rome differed markedly from that of their southern neighbours. Rather than experiencing conquest and direct incorporation, they maintained their independence while engaging in diplomatic and commercial relationships with the Roman administration. Roman coins found at Votadini sites demonstrate sustained contact, while the absence of Roman military installations in their core territory suggests a mutually beneficial arrangement that allowed Rome to focus its military resources elsewhere, while securing the Votadini as a buffer against more hostile northern tribes. The Novantae controlled the southwestern regions of what is now Dumfries and Galloway, with their territory extending across the fertile lowlands between the Solway Firth and the Galloway Hills. Their principal settlements included fortified sites at Rispain Camp near Whithorn and the massive hill fort at Trustees Hill, which recent archaeological work has revealed to contain Pictish symbols carved into the bedrock, suggesting complex cultural interactions across tribal boundaries. The Novantae's position gave them control over important sea routes across the Irish Sea, facilitating connections with Ireland that would prove significant in the later spread of Christianity throughout the region. The Selgovae occupied the central southern uplands, establishing settlements in the valleys of the Yarrow, Ettrick and Teviot rivers. Their territory included formidable hill forts such as Eldon Hill North, which covered 40 acres and contained evidence for over 300 individual roundhouses, suggesting a substantial population concentration. The strategic position of Selgovae territory, controlling key passes through these southern uplands, made them important players in the broader political landscape of northern Britain. Roman military intervention in northern Britain began in earnest during the governorship of Gnaeus Julius Agricola from 78 to 84 AD. His campaigns, documented by his son-in-law Tacitus, reveal the systematic approach Roman forces took to subduing the northern tribes. The construction of a network of forts, temporary camps and roads created an infrastructure that would profoundly influence the region's development. Major fortifications like Inchtusil in Perthshire, designed to accommodate an entire legion, demonstrate the scale of Roman ambitions in the north, even though many of these installations proved temporary as imperial priorities shifted. The establishment of Hadrian's Wall in 122 AD under the Emperor Hadrian marked a fundamental shift in Roman strategy from expansion to consolidation. Stretching 84 Roman miles from Wallsend on the River Tyne to Bowness-on-Solway, the wall incorporated 16 major forts, 80-mile castles, and 160 turrets, creating the most heavily fortified frontier in the Roman Empire. The wall's construction required an estimated 9,000 soldiers working for 6 years, moving over 1 million tons of stone and creating a barrier that stood 15 feet high, with a parapet adding another 6 feet. The wall's impact extended far beyond its military function. The civilian settlements, or vici, that grew up around the forts created new centres of population and economic activity. At Housesteads, archaeological evidence reveals a thriving community with shops, taverns, temples and workshops clustered around the fort's southern defences. The presence of merchants, craftsmen and camp followers created a unique Romano-British culture that blended military efficiency with civilian enterprise. 20 years after Hadrian's Wall, the Antonine Wall pushed the Roman frontier 100 miles further north, running 39 miles from Bowness on the Forth to Old Kilpatrick on the Clyde. Constructed primarily of turf and timber rather than stone, this wall incorporated 19 forts and numerous smaller installations. The Antonine Wall's brief occupation, lasting only about 20 years before abandonment around 162 AD, reflected the challenges of maintaining extended supply lines and controlling hostile territory with limited manpower. The Roman military presence fundamentally altered the political landscape of northern Britain. The establishment of major fortress towns like Eboracum, Diva and Caerleon created new centres of power that drew tribal elites into Roman administrative systems. The development of smaller market towns like Corbridge, which grew from a military supply depot into a major commercial centre, provided new opportunities for trade and cultural exchange that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. Roman civil administration in the north operated through a combination of direct rule in conquered territories and client relationships with cooperative tribes. The civitas system, which granted limited self-governance to tribal territories under Roman oversight, allowed indigenous political structures to survive in modified forms. The civitas of the Brigantes, centred at Isurium Brigantum, maintained traditional territorial boundaries while adopting Roman administrative practices and legal systems. The archaeological record reveals the gradual adoption of Roman material culture throughout the region. Villa complexes like those at Beedlam and Well in North Yorkshire demonstrate how Romano-British elites embraced Roman architectural styles, decorative arts and lifestyle practices. These establishments featured sophisticated heating systems, painted wall plasters, mosaic floors and bathhouses that rivaled contemporary examples from Gaul and the Rhineland. The Roman road network created lasting changes to settlement patterns and economic relationships throughout northern Britain. Major routes like Dare Street, running from Eboracum to the Antonine Wall, and the road from Carlisle to Newcastle facilitated not only military movement, but also commercial traffic that connected previously isolated communities. Milestones, mansiones, and smaller settlements grew up along these routes, creating new focal points for regional development. The introduction of Roman coinage revolutionized economic relationships throughout the region. Hordes of Roman coins found at sites across northern Britain demonstrate the penetration of monetary exchange systems into areas that had previously relied on barter and gift exchange. The presence of locally produced pottery imitating Roman forms, alongside imported goods like Samian ware from Gaul and amphorae from the Mediterranean, reveals the integration of northern British communities into empire-wide trade networks. Christianity's arrival in northern Britain occurred gradually during the late Roman period, with evidence suggesting multiple routes of transmission. The presence of Christian symbols on artefacts from sites like Vindolanda and the discovery of early Christian burials at locations such as Poundbury in Dorset indicate that the new religion had begun to establish itself among both military and civilian populations by the 3rd century AD. The conversion of Constantine in 312 AD accelerated this process, with official imperial support facilitating the construction of churches and the appointment of bishops to major urban centres. The archaeological evidence from sites like Whithorn in Galloway suggests that Christianity may have established particularly strong roots in the territories of the Novanti and other southwestern tribes. The tradition associating St. Ninian with the establishment of a church at Whithorn in the late 4th or early 5th century, while not conclusively proven archaeologically, aligns with evidence for early Christian activity in the region. Carved stones bearing Christian symbols and Latin inscriptions from this period demonstrate the presence of literate Christian communities capable of sophisticated theological and artistic expression. The gradual withdrawal of Roman military forces from Britain began in the late 4th century, as imperial resources were redirected to defend against barbarian incursions along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. The usurpation of Magnus Maximus in 383 AD, who withdrew significant numbers of troops from Britain for his continental campaigns, marked the beginning of a process that would culminate in the complete abandonment of Roman administration by the early 5th century. The collapse of Roman civil government created a power vacuum that existing Romano-British elites struggled to fill. Archaeological evidence from sites like Burd Doswald on Hadrian's Wall reveals the transformation of Roman military installations into civilian settlements, with timber halls built within former barracks blocks and evidence for continued occupation well into the 5th century. These adaptations suggest that local communities attempted to maintain some semblance of organised authority in the absence of imperial administration. The survival of Romano-British culture into the post-Roman period is evidenced by the continuation of urban life at centres like Carlisle, where archaeological excavations have revealed sustained occupation and the maintenance of Roman-style buildings into the 6th century. The presence of imported pottery and other luxury goods at these sites indicates that trade networks, while reduced, continued to function after the formal end of Roman rule. The transformation of tribal territories into the kingdoms of the Old North built upon foundations established during the Roman period. The administrative boundaries of the civitates, the road networks that connected major settlements, and the political relationships forged between Roman authorities and tribal elites all contributed to the emerging post-Roman political landscape. The archaeological record demonstrates remarkable continuity in settlement patterns, with many sites showing unbroken occupation from the late Roman through these early medieval periods, suggesting that the transition from Roman to native rule was often gradual rather than catastrophic. The disintegration of Roman administrative control across northern Britain created opportunities for indigenous leaders to establish new forms of political organisation that drew upon both pre-Roman tribal traditions and Romano-British institutional frameworks. Archaeological evidence from major settlement sites demonstrates that the transition from imperial to native rule was neither uniform nor sudden, with many communities maintaining Roman-style governance structures while gradually adapting to new political realities. The figure of Coel Hen, known to later Welsh tradition as the progenitor of numerous northern dynasties, emerges from this transitional period as a pivotal character in the establishment of post-Roman political authority. Historical analysis suggests that Coel, whose epithet hen means the old, may have been a Romano-British official who successfully maintained control over former imperial territories in the late 4th or early 5th century. The genealogical traditions preserved in medieval Welsh manuscripts, particularly the Harleian genealogies and the Jesus College MS-20, trace the descent of multiple northern royal houses from this foundational figure. Archaeological investigations at sites traditionally associated with Coel's descendants reveal substantial modifications to existing Roman infrastructure during this period. At Corsta Pitum near Hadrian's Wall, excavations have uncovered evidence of large timber halls constructed within the ruins of Roman buildings, suggesting the establishment of new centres of authority that deliberately incorporated symbols of imperial power. These halls, measuring up to 30 metres in length, featured raised platforms for high-status seating and central hearths that could accommodate substantial retinues, indicating the emergence of warrior aristocracies similar to those described in contemporary continental sources. The Kingdom of Rheged, which emerged as the most powerful of the northern British polities, controlled territories extending from the Solway Firth across the Lake District and into the Yorkshire Dales. The royal centre at Carlisle, known in Brythonic as Caer Ligualid, maintained many characteristics of Roman urban organisation while adapting to new political requirements. Excavations in the cathedral precinct have revealed a sequence of substantial timber buildings constructed over Roman foundations, with evidence for metalworking, fine pottery production, and the continued use of Roman-style hypocaust heating systems well into the 6th century. The political structure of Rheged appears to have combined elements of Roman administrative practice with traditional Celtic kingship. Inscribed stones from the region, such as the 5th century memorial at Kirkmadreen in Galloway, demonstrate the survival of Latin literacy among the ruling elite, while incorporating distinctly British artistic motifs. The use of Latin titles alongside Brythonic personal names suggests a deliberate attempt to maintain continuity with Roman governmental traditions while asserting native political authority. The kingdom's military organisation reflected this synthesis of Roman and Celtic elements. Archaeological evidence from hill forts like Trustee's Hill reveals the construction of new defensive works during the 5th century, with stone ramparts incorporating Roman masonry techniques but following traditional Celtic fortress designs. The discovery of high-status metalwork, including elaborate penannular brooches and decorated belt fittings, indicates the presence of a warrior elite equipped with weapons and ornaments that combined Roman craftsmanship with native artistic preferences. Strathclyde, centred on the fortress of Alclut at Dumbarton Rock, controlled the approaches to the Clyde Valley and maintained important maritime connections with Ireland and the Atlantic regions. The strategic position of Dumbarton Rock, rising 240 feet above the River Clyde, provided a virtually impregnable fortress that commanded both river and overland routes into the Scottish Highlands. Archaeological investigations on the rock have revealed evidence for continuous occupation from the Iron Age through the early medieval period, with substantial timber buildings and sophisticated water management systems that supported considerable population. The rulers of Strathclyde appear to have maintained particularly strong connections with Irish Gaelic culture, as evidenced by the presence of Irish-style artefacts and the adoption of certain Irish political practices. Ogham inscriptions found in the region demonstrate familiarity with Irish writing systems, while the archaeological record reveals the presence of Irish-style metalwork and pottery forms that suggest sustained cultural exchange across the North Channel. The political organisation of Strathclyde incorporated elements derived from Irish Tuath systems, with evidence suggesting that the kingdom was divided into territorial units governed by subordinate nobles who owed military service to the paramount king at Alclut. This decentralised structure allowed for effective control over the kingdom's extensive territories while maintaining the flexibility necessary to respond to external threats from Pictish, Anglo-Saxon, and Irish competitors. The Kingdom of Elmet occupied the strategic territory between the Pennines and the North York Moors. controlling important river valleys and mountain passes that connected the northern regions with the emerging Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the south and east. The royal centre at Barwick in Elmet, known in Brythonic as Caer Lloydcoit, featured substantial earthwork defences that incorporated both Roman engineering techniques and traditional British hill fort design principles. Archaeological evidence from Elmet reveals a kingdom that maintained particularly strong continuity with Romano-British traditions. Excavations at sites like Aberford have uncovered evidence for the continued production of Romano-British pottery styles well into the 6th century, while the presence of late Roman coins and metalwork suggests the survival of monetary exchange systems that had largely disappeared elsewhere in post-Roman Britain. The political structure of Elmet appears to have been more centralised than that of its northern neighbours, with evidence suggesting direct royal control over major settlements and strategic resources. The kingdom's position as a buffer between the British territories of the north and the expanding Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Mercia and Northumbria required strong defensive capabilities and sophisticated diplomatic relationships with multiple competing powers. The territories of the Gododin, centred on the fortress of Dyn Eidyn at Edinburgh, controlled the eastern approaches to the Scottish lowlands and maintained important connections with both Pictish and Anglo-Saxon neighbours. The volcanic plug of Edinburgh Castle Rock, rising 435 feet above the surrounding landscape, provided a naturally defensible position that had been fortified since the Bronze Age. Archaeological investigations have revealed evidence for substantial timber buildings constructed during the 5th and 6th centuries, with sophisticated drainage systems and evidence for metalworking activities that suggest the presence of a substantial royal court. The political organisation of the Gododin territories appears to have been based on a confederation of related kindreds, each controlling discrete territorial units but acknowledging the paramount authority of the king at Dyn Eidyn. This system, reflected in the genealogical traditions preserved in medieval Welsh sources, allowed for considerable local autonomy while maintaining unified military command when external threats required coordinated responses. The military culture of the Gododin, as preserved in the early medieval poem Why Gododin attributed to the bard Aneurin, reveals a warrior society that emphasised personal valour, loyalty to kinship groups, and the importance of heroic reputation. Archaeological evidence from weapon hoards and high-status burials confirms the presence of a heavily armed warrior elite equipped with long swords, spears, and shields that combined Roman metallurgical techniques with traditional Celtic decorative styles. The emergence of these kingdoms occurred within a broader context of population movements and territorial reorganisation that affected the entire region. The establishment of Irish Gaelic settlements in western Scotland, traditionally associated with the migration of the Scots from Dalriada in Northern Ireland, created new political dynamics that required the British kingdoms to develop sophisticated diplomatic and military responses. Archaeological evidence from sites like Dunad in Argyll reveals the establishment of substantial Irish settlements during the 5th century, with evidence for the construction of hill forts, the production of distinctive Irish-style artefacts, and the maintenance of close cultural connections with Ireland. The presence of Ogham inscriptions and Irish ecclesiastical sites demonstrates the transplantation of complete cultural and religious systems rather than simple population movements. The interaction between these Irish settlers and the existing British populations appears to have been complex and varied. In some areas, particularly along the western coasts, archaeological evidence suggests peaceful coexistence and cultural exchange, with mixed artefact assemblages indicating intermarriage and cultural synthesis. In other regions, particularly those with strategic importance or valuable resources, evidence for conflict and territorial competition is more apparent. The political structures that emerged during this period reflected the need to balance traditional tribal loyalties with the practical requirements of territorial defence and resource management. The concept of the Men of the North, preserved in later Welsh literature as Gwy Gogledd, represented a shared cultural identity that transcended individual kingdom boundaries while maintaining distinct political autonomies. This shared identity was reinforced by common linguistic, religious, and cultural traditions that distinguished the British kingdoms from their Irish, Pictish, and Anglo-Saxon neighbours. The archaeological record reveals remarkably consistent material culture across the region, with similar pottery styles, metalworking techniques, and architectural forms appearing at sites throughout the northern British territories. The military organisation of these kingdoms incorporated innovations that reflected both Roman military traditions and Celtic warrior customs. Evidence from weapon hoards and fortification sites suggests the development of combined arms tactics that utilised both heavy infantry formations, derived from Roman models, and light cavalry forces that drew upon traditional Celtic military practices. The establishment of territorial boundaries between the emerging kingdoms appears to have followed natural geographic features, while respecting traditional tribal territories and Roman administrative divisions. River valleys, mountain ridges, and coastal features provided defensible frontiers that could be effectively patrolled and controlled with limited manpower resources. The economic foundations of these kingdoms relied heavily on agricultural production, with archaeological evidence revealing the continued cultivation of Roman period field systems and the establishment of new agricultural settlements in previously marginal areas. The presence of sophisticated storage facilities, including underground souterrains and above-ground granaries, indicates the development of surplus production capabilities that could support substantial non-agricultural populations. Trade relationships with neighbouring regions continued despite political fragmentation, with archaeological evidence revealing the movement of goods across kingdom boundaries and the maintenance of connections with continental European markets. The presence of imported pottery, metalwork, and other luxury goods at high-status sites demonstrates the survival of exchange networks that had developed during the Roman period. The religious landscape of the emerging kingdoms reflected the complex inheritance of Roman Christianity, traditional Celtic beliefs, and new influences from Irish and continental sources. Archaeological evidence from sites like Whithorn reveals the establishment of substantial Christian communities during this period, with evidence for church construction, Christian burial practices, and the production of Christian artistic works. The integration of Christian institutions into the political structures of the kingdoms provided new sources of legitimacy and administrative capability. The appointment of bishops and the establishment of monasteries created networks of educated clergy who could provide literacy, legal expertise, and diplomatic services that were essential for effective governance in the post-Roman environment. The consolidation of political power across the northern British kingdoms during the 6th century rested fundamentally upon the military capabilities of professional warrior bands whose organisation and culture represented a synthesis of Roman military traditions and indigenous Celtic practices. These warrior elites, known in contemporary Welsh sources as the Tulu, formed the backbone of royal authority and territorial control throughout Hen Ogledd. Archaeological evidence from major settlement sites reveals the emergence of a sophisticated military culture that combined advanced metallurgical techniques with traditional concepts of personal honour and kinship loyalty. The comitatus system that developed across the northern kingdoms drew heavily upon both Roman military organisation and Germanic warrior band structures that had been observed and adapted during centuries of frontier contact. At its core, this system centred upon the personal relationship between a king or lord and his sworn warriors, who received weapons, armour, sustenance and treasure in exchange for military service and absolute loyalty. Excavations at royal centres like Carlisle and Dumbarton Rock have uncovered substantial hall complexes specifically designed to accommodate these warrior retinues, with raised platforms for high-status seating and central hearth areas capable of hosting elaborate feasting ceremonies that reinforce social bonds and hierarchical relationships. The Tulu represented the professional military corps of each kingdom's armed forces, typically numbering between 100 and 300 warriors, depending upon the realm's size and resources. These men were distinguished from ordinary militia levies by their full-time military status, superior equipment, and intensive training in weapons handling and tactical formations. Archaeological evidence from weapon hoards, discovered at sites like Traprain Law and Trusty's Hill, reveals the sophisticated metallurgical techniques employed in producing the arms and armour that equipped these elite warriors. The primary weapon of the northern British warrior was the longsword, typically measuring between 75 and 85 centimetres in length, with a broad double-edged blade capable of both cutting and thrusting attacks. Metallurgical analysis of surviving examples reveals the use of pattern welding techniques that created blades of exceptional strength and flexibility through the careful manipulation of iron and steel components. The hilts featured elaborate guards and pommels decorated with intricate knotwork patterns and inlaid precious metals that proclaimed the owner's status and wealth. Spears served as both primary weapons and symbols of authority throughout the warrior culture of Hen Ogledd. Archaeological examples range from light javelins designed for throwing to heavy thrusting spears exceeding 2 meters in length. The spearheads themselves display remarkable craftsmanship, with leaf-shaped blades featuring pronounced ridges that provided both structural strength and improved penetration capabilities. Many examples bear runic inscriptions or Celtic artistic motifs that suggest these weapons possess ceremonial as well as practical significance. The shield remained the warrior's primary defensive equipment, typically constructed from lime or poplar wood planks covered with leather and reinforced with iron rim binding. Archaeological reconstruction based on metal fittings recovered from burial sites indicates shields measuring approximately 60 centimeters in diameter, with central iron bosses that could serve as offensive weapons in close combat. The decorative elements preserved on shield bosses and rim fittings reveal sophisticated artistic traditions that combined Roman provincial styles with distinctively Celtic geometric patterns. Body armour among the northern British warriors consisted primarily of mail shirts constructed from thousands of interlocking iron rings. The production of mail armour required exceptional metallurgical skill and represented a substantial investment of resources, making it available only to the wealthiest warriors and their immediate retainers. Archaeological evidence suggests that most warriors relied upon thick leather jerkins, reinforced with metal studs or scales for protection, with complete mail shirts reserved for kings, their champions, and the most distinguished members of the Tulu. Helmets appear to have been relatively rare among the northern British warriors, with archaeological evidence suggesting that most fighters relied upon thick felt caps or leather headgear for protection. The few helmet fragments recovered from high-status burial sites reveal sophisticated construction techniques, incorporating both iron and bronze elements, with decorative crests and face guards that proclaimed the wearer's elite status. The scarcity of helmet finds may reflect both the high cost of production and the cultural preference for displaying one's face in battle as a demonstration of courage and honour. The archaeological record from major hill forts reveals the sophisticated defensive strategies employed by the northern kingdoms during this period. Dumbarton Rock, the fortress capital of Strathclyde, underwent substantial modifications during the 6th century that transformed the ancient hill fort into a virtually impregnable stronghold. The construction of multiple defensive walls following the natural contours of the volcanic plug created a series of defensive zones that could be held successively as attackers advanced up the steep slopes. Archaeological investigations have revealed evidence for sophisticated water storage systems, granaries, and workshops that could sustain a substantial garrison during extended sieges. Traprain Law in the territory of the Gododin presents equally impressive evidence for advanced fortification techniques. The massive earthwork defences that crown the hill encompass an area of approximately 40 acres, with ramparts reaching heights of over 6 metres in some sections. The discovery of substantial quantities of metalworking debris within the fort indicates the presence of armourers' workshops capable of producing and maintaining the weapons and equipment required by the garrison. Stone-lined pits containing charcoal and iron slag suggest the operation of sophisticated bloomery furnaces that could produce high-quality steel for weapon manufacture. The limited evidence for cavalry warfare among the northern British kingdoms reflects both practical considerations and cultural preferences that distinguish them from their continental contemporaries. The mountainous terrain and extensive boglands that characterised much of Hen Ogledd favoured infantry tactics over mounted combat, while the relatively small size of native British horses limited their effectiveness as cavalry mounts. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites reveals the presence of horses, but analysis of bone remains suggests these animals were primarily used for transportation and agricultural work rather than military purposes. The few references to mounted warriors in contemporary sources appear to describe light cavalry forces used primarily for reconnaissance, pursuit of fleeing enemies, and rapid movement between battlefields rather than shock combat roles. The discovery of horse bridles and riding equipment at high-status sites indicates that kings and nobles certainly rode horses, but the absence of specialised cavalry weapons or horse armour suggests that mounted combat played a secondary role in military planning. Infantry warfare dominated the military culture of the northern kingdoms, with tactical systems that emphasised the coordinated use of spear formations supported by sword-armed warriors and missile troops. The influence of Roman military traditions is evident in the disciplined formations described in contemporary poetry and the sophisticated siege techniques employed in hill-fort warfare. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites, though limited, suggests the use of shield wall tactics similar to those employed by contemporary Anglo-Saxon and Frankish armies. The warrior culture that emerged across Hen Ogledd found its most vivid expression in the corpus of early Welsh poetry that preserves contemporary accounts of military values, battle descriptions, and heroic ideals. The poem Why Gododin, attributed to the bard Aneurin and describing a military expedition from Dyn Aydin to Catreth, provides detailed insights into the warrior mentality that dominated northern British society during this period. The verses emphasise concepts of personal honour, loyalty to kinship groups, and the pursuit of glorious death in battle as the highest achievement available to a warrior. The relationship between warrior and lord that forms the central theme of this poetry reflects the fundamental social bonds that held the military system together. Warriors were expected to demonstrate absolute loyalty to their lord, fighting to the death in his defence and avenging any injuries or insults directed against him. In return, lords were obligated to provide their followers with weapons, armour, horses and generous hospitality, while ensuring that their achievements received appropriate recognition through gift-giving and public praise. The concept of honour that permeated warrior culture extended beyond simple battlefield courage to encompass a complex code of conduct that governed all aspects of a warrior's behaviour. Archaeological evidence from high-status burial sites reveals the material expressions of this honour culture, with elaborate grave goods that proclaim the deceased's achievements and social status. Weapons were frequently buried with their owners, often deliberately damaged or killed to accompany the warrior into the afterlife. Feasting played a crucial role in maintaining the social bonds that united warrior bands and reinforced hierarchical relationships within the military system. Archaeological excavations at royal halls have uncovered evidence for elaborate dining arrangements that could accommodate hundreds of participants, with designated seating areas that reflected precise social rankings. The discovery of imported pottery, glass vessels, and exotic foodstuffs demonstrates the lengths to which rulers went to provide impressive hospitality for their followers. The distribution of treasure and war spoils served as a primary mechanism for maintaining warrior loyalty and motivation. Contemporary poetry describes kings as gold givers and ring distributors, emphasizing their role as sources of material reward for military service. Archaeological evidence from hoards and individual finds reveals the circulation of substantial quantities of precious metals, decorated weapons, and luxury goods throughout the warrior elite. The practice of rewarding distinguished service with valuable gifts created powerful incentives for heroic behavior while demonstrating the ruler's wealth and generosity. The training and preparation of warriors began in childhood among the noble families that provided the military elite. Young men were sent to the courts of allied rulers to serve as pages and squires, learning weapons handling, horsemanship, and the complex social codes that governed warrior behavior. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites reveals the presence of practice weapons, including blunted swords and spear points that were used in training exercises designed to develop the skills necessary for effective combat. The religious aspects of warrior culture incorporated both Christian and traditional Celtic elements that reflected the complex spiritual landscape of 6th century Britain. Archaeological evidence from weapon hoards suggests the continuation of ritual practices involving the deliberate deposition of arms and armour in sacred locations, possibly as offerings to ensure victory or commemorate fallen warriors. Christian symbols appear on weapons and military equipment, indicating the integration of the new faith into traditional warrior customs. The seasonal nature of warfare in the northern kingdoms reflected both practical considerations and cultural traditions that governed military campaigns. The agricultural calendar determined the availability of manpower for military expeditions, with most major campaigns occurring during the summer months when crops required minimal attention and weather conditions favoured extended operations. Archaeological evidence from hill forts reveals the construction of seasonal accommodation that could house expanded garrisons during periods of heightened military activity. The logistics of maintaining warrior bands required sophisticated, organisational capabilities that drew upon both Roman administrative traditions and indigenous resource management systems. The provisioning of armies in the field demanded careful planning and substantial material resources, with evidence suggesting the development of supply networks that could support forces operating far from their home territories. Archaeological investigations at temporary campsites have revealed the remains of field kitchens, equipment repair facilities, and temporary fortifications that demonstrate the organisational sophistication of northern British military forces. The impact of this military culture extended far beyond the immediate circle of professional warriors to influence all aspects of society throughout the northern kingdoms. The values and ideals celebrated in warrior poetry became cultural norms that shaped legal systems, social relationships, and artistic expression across Hen Ogledd. Archaeological evidence reveals the widespread adoption of military symbolism in decorative arts, with weapon motifs appearing on everything from jewellery to household implements. The ascension of Urien to the throne of Rhaegar around 550 AD marked the beginning of what would become the most celebrated period in the history of the northern British kingdoms. Urien's reign, lasting approximately 4 decades until his death around 590 AD, represented the pinnacle of Hen Ogledd military and cultural achievement, during which the Kingdom of Rhaegar emerged as the dominant power capable of coordinating resistance against Anglo-Saxon expansion, while fostering a court culture that would preserve the memory of British heroism for centuries to come. Archaeological evidence from Carlisle reveals substantial modifications to the royal complex during the mid-6th century, with the construction of an impressive timber hall, measuring over 40 metres in length and 12 metres in width. The building's sophisticated post and beam construction incorporated Roman masonry techniques while following traditional Celtic architectural principles, creating a structure capable of accommodating the expanded royal household and warrior retinue that reflected Rhaegar's growing power. Excavations have uncovered evidence for elaborate metalworking facilities within the royal precinct, including specialised forges capable of producing the high-quality weapons and decorative metalwork that equipped Urien's military forces and served as diplomatic gifts to allied rulers. The territorial extent of Urien's kingdom encompassed the traditional heartland of Reged around Carlisle and the Solway Firth, but expanded significantly during his reign to include substantial portions of the Lake District, the Yorkshire Dales, and coastal regions extending north into modern Dumfriesshire. This expansion was achieved through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic marriage alliances, and the voluntary submission of lesser rulers who recognised the advantages of association with Reged's growing power. Inscribed stones from this period, such as the memorial at Kirkmudreen, demonstrate the extension of Reged's influence into previously independent territories through the appointment of Urien's kinsmen to governing positions. Urien's military campaigns against the expanding Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria represented the most sustained and successful British resistance to Germanic settlement in the post-Roman period. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and contemporary Northumbrian sources, though naturally biased against British achievements, nevertheless acknowledge the effectiveness of Urien's military leadership and the substantial territorial losses inflicted upon the emerging English kingdoms. Archaeological evidence from sites along the traditional boundaries between British and Anglo-Saxon territories reveals the construction of new defensive works during this period, including the strengthening of existing hill forts and the establishment of new fortified positions that controlled strategic river crossings and mountain passes. The most significant of Urien's military victories occurred on the island of Anglesey, known in Welsh as Mon, where a coalition of northern British forces under his leadership decisively defeated an Anglo-Saxon army that had been attempting to establish a permanent foothold in North Wales. Contemporary Welsh poetry describes this battle as a crushing defeat for the Angles, with substantial numbers of enemy warriors killed and their leadership structure effectively destroyed. Archaeological investigations on Anglesey have uncovered evidence for a major military engagement during this period, including weapon fragments, human remains showing signs of violent death, and the hasty burial of substantial quantities of military equipment. The strategic importance of the Anglesey campaign extended far beyond its immediate military results. The Anglo-Saxon attempt to establish control over this fertile island represented a coordinated effort to outflank the British kingdoms by securing a base from which to threaten their western territories and disrupt their connections with Irish allies. Urien's successful intervention demonstrated the continued capability of the British kingdoms to project military power across substantial distances and coordinate complex amphibious operations that required sophisticated logistical planning and naval resources. The naval aspects of Urien's military campaigns reveal the sophisticated maritime capabilities that Reged had developed during his reign. Archaeological evidence from coastal sites suggests the construction of substantial harbour facilities capable of supporting large-scale military expeditions, while the discovery of ship fittings and maritime equipment indicates the operation of a substantial fleet. The ability to transport significant military forces across the Irish Sea to Anglesey required vessels capable of carrying hundreds of warriors along with their weapons, horses and supplies, suggesting the existence of purpose-built military transports or the requisition of substantial numbers of civilian vessels. Following the Anglesey victory, Urien's forces launched a series of campaigns against Anglo-Saxon settlements in the Yorkshire region, systematically reducing fortified positions and reclaiming territories that had been lost to Germanic settlers during the previous decades. The archaeological record from sites like Catterick reveals evidence for the destruction of Anglo-Saxon defensive works during this period, with layers of burning and deliberate demolition that suggest coordinated military operations rather than random raiding. The recovery of British control over these strategic locations effectively halted Anglo-Saxon expansion westward and forced the Northumbrian kingdom to consolidate its existing territories rather than pursuing further conquest. The siege of Lindisfarne represents perhaps the most audacious of Urien's military enterprises. demonstrating the extent to which British forces had regained the initiative against their Anglo-Saxon opponents. Contemporary sources describe a prolonged blockade of the tidal island that served as an important Anglo-Saxon stronghold, with British forces maintaining their positions for several months while systematically reducing the defenders' capacity for resistance. The logistical requirements for sustaining such an extended siege operation reveal the sophisticated organisational capabilities that Urian's military system had developed, including the establishment of supply lines, the construction of siege works, and the coordination of naval and land-based forces. Archaeological evidence from Lindisfarne confirms the occurrence of a major siege during the late 6th century, with excavations revealing the hasty construction of additional defensive works and evidence for the storage of substantial quantities of provisions within the fortress. The discovery of British-style artefacts within the Anglo-Saxon layers suggests either the presence of British forces within the stronghold or the successful conclusion of the siege with the installation of British administrators. The strategic implications of controlling Lindisfarne extended far beyond its immediate military value, as the island commanded important sea routes along the Northumbrian coast and served as a base for naval operations throughout the region. The court culture that flourished under Urian's patronage represented the pinnacle of early Welsh literary and artistic achievement, establishing traditions that would influence Celtic culture for centuries to come. The royal court at Carlisle became a centre of learning and artistic production that attracted scholars, poets and craftsmen from throughout the Celtic world. Archaeological evidence reveals the presence of substantial libraries and scriptoria within the royal complex, with the discovery of writing materials, illuminated manuscript fragments, and sophisticated book production equipment that demonstrates the high level of literacy and intellectual activity that characterised Urian's court. The bard Taliesin emerged as the most celebrated poet of Urian's court, producing a substantial corpus of praise poetry that not only commemorated the king's military achievements, but also established the literary conventions that would define Welsh heroic poetry for generations. Taliesin's poems, preserved in medieval manuscripts but clearly reflecting authentic 6th century traditions, provide detailed descriptions of Urian's military campaigns, his personal characteristics, and the cultural values that defined his reign. The sophistication of these compositions, with their complex metrical structures and elaborate metaphorical language, reveals the existence of a highly developed bardic tradition that combined oral performance techniques with written literary practices. The historical accuracy of Taliesin's poetry has been confirmed by archaeological evidence from many of the sites mentioned in his compositions. References to specific battles, geographical locations, and military tactics align closely with archaeological findings from the relevant periods and locations, suggesting that these poems served as genuine historical records rather than purely fictional entertainments. The detailed descriptions of weapons, armour and military equipment found in the poetry correspond closely to archaeological examples from contemporary sites, providing valuable insights into the material culture of Urian's court and military forces. The patronage system that supported bardic activity at Urian's court represented a sophisticated cultural institution that served multiple political and social functions. Bards were responsible not only for entertaining the royal household, but also for preserving historical memory, legitimising political authority, and maintaining diplomatic relationships with neighbouring rulers. The complex training required to master the bardic arts included extensive memorisation of genealogies, legal precedents, and historical traditions, making bards valuable repositories of knowledge that extended far beyond their literary capabilities. Archaeological evidence from the royal complex at Carlisle reveals the physical arrangements that supported bardic performances and court ceremonies. The Great Hall featured a raised platform area designated for formal presentations, with acoustic properties that enhance the projection of spoken verse and musical accompaniment. The discovery of musical instruments, including fragments of harps and other stringed instruments, demonstrates the sophisticated musical traditions that accompanied poetic performances. The presence of specialized seating arrangements for different categories of court personnel reflects the complex social hierarchies that governed access to royal entertainment and cultural events. The political alliances that Urien forged with other northern British kingdoms represented a sophisticated diplomatic strategy that maximised the collective military capabilities of Hen Ogledd, while respecting the autonomy of individual rulers. Marriage alliances played a crucial role in cementing these relationships, with Urien's children and kinsmen forming matrimonial connections with the royal houses of Strathclyde, Elmet, and the Gododin territories. Archaeological evidence from royal burial sites reveals the exchange of prestigious grave goods between allied kingdoms, suggesting the maintenance of gift exchange networks that reinforced political relationships through material expressions of mutual respect and obligation. The alliance system that emerged under Urien's leadership created an effective framework for coordinating military responses to external threats, while avoiding the internal conflicts that had weakened British resistance during earlier periods. Contemporary sources describe joint military expeditions involving forces from multiple kingdoms operating under unified command structures that respected traditional territorial boundaries while maximising operational effectiveness. The success of these collaborative efforts depended upon sophisticated communication networks and standardised military procedures that allowed forces from different kingdoms to operate together effectively. The relationship between Rhaead and the Kingdom of Strathclyde represented perhaps the most important of these political alliances, as the two realms controlled complementary territories that together dominated the western approaches to the Scottish lowlands. Archaeological evidence suggests regular diplomatic exchanges between the courts at Carlisle and Dumbarton Rock, with the discovery of distinctive artefacts and artistic styles that indicate sustained cultural interaction. The coordination of military campaigns between these kingdoms required careful planning and mutual trust, as joint operations often involve the movement of substantial forces across territorial boundaries and the sharing of intelligence about enemy activities. Internal dynastic conflicts within the northern kingdoms posed constant challenges to Urien's alliance-building efforts, as succession disputes and territorial rivalries threatened to undermine the unity necessary for effective resistance against Anglo-Saxon expansion. The complex kinship relationships that governed royal succession created multiple claimants for most thrones, leading to civil wars that diverted military resources from external campaigns and provided opportunities for enemy intervention. Urien's diplomatic skills proved crucial in mediating these disputes and maintaining the stability necessary for sustained military cooperation. The succession crisis in Elmet during the 570s exemplified both the challenges and opportunities presented by internal conflicts within the allied kingdoms. When the ruling dynasty faced challenges from rival claimants supported by different factions of the nobility, Urien's intervention proved decisive in maintaining stability and preventing the kingdom's collapse. Archaeological evidence from major settlements in Elmet reveals the construction of new defensive works during this period, suggesting the deployment of Rhaead military forces to support the legitimate ruler against his rivals. The successful resolution of this crisis strengthened the alliance between Rhaead and Elmet, while demonstrating Urien's growing influence throughout the region. The economic foundations that supported Urien's military and cultural achievements required sophisticated resource management and the development of new revenue sources that could sustain the expanded royal household and professional military forces. Archaeological evidence reveals substantial improvements in agricultural productivity during this period, including the construction of new field systems, the introduction of improved farming techniques, and the expansion of cultivation into previously marginal areas. The development of specialised craft production, particularly metalworking and textile manufacture, created export goods that could be traded for the luxury items and military equipment required by the royal court. The control of trade routes represented a crucial element in Reged's economic strategy, as the kingdom's position astride important overland and maritime connections provided opportunities to levy tolls and customs duties on commercial traffic. Archaeological evidence from major settlements along these routes reveals the construction of substantial market facilities and the presence of foreign merchants who brought exotic goods from throughout the Celtic world and beyond. The discovery of imported pottery, glassware and metalwork at sites throughout Reged's territories demonstrates the kingdom's integration into broader trade networks that extended from Ireland to continental Europe. The mining and metalworking industries that flourished under Urien's patronage provided both the raw materials necessary for weapon production and valuable export commodities that enhanced the kingdom's economic position. Archaeological investigations in the Lake District have uncovered evidence for substantial iron extraction and processing operations that supplied the raw materials for the royal armouries at Carlisle. The presence of specialised smelting facilities and the discovery of high-quality iron ingots suggest the development of standardised production techniques that could supply the military requirements of multiple allied kingdoms. The Kingdom of the Gododin occupied the strategically crucial territories extending from the volcanic fortress of Din Aidin eastward to the North Sea coast, encompassing the fertile lowlands of the Lothians and the defensive uplands of the Lammermuir Hills. This realm, inheriting its name and territorial boundaries from the Iron Age Votadini tribe, controlled the primary overland routes between the northern British kingdoms and the expanding Anglo-Saxon territories of Northumbria. Archaeological evidence from major settlement sites reveals a sophisticated political organisation that combined elements of traditional Celtic kingship with administrative practices derived from Romano-British governmental systems. Din Aidin, perched atop the dramatic volcanic plug that rises 435 feet above the surrounding landscape, served as the political and military centre of Gododin power throughout the 6th century. The fortress complex that crowned this natural stronghold incorporated both ancient defensive works dating to the Bronze Age and substantial new constructions reflecting the military requirements of post-Roman warfare. Excavations conducted on the castle rock have uncovered evidence for massive timber halls constructed during the late 6th century, with sophisticated drainage systems and evidence for metalworking activities that indicate the presence of a substantial royal court capable of supporting several hundred warriors and their dependents. The political structure of the Gododin kingdom reflected the complex kinship relationships that governed succession and territorial control throughout Hen Ogledd. Unlike the more centralised monarchies of Reged or Strathclyde, the Gododin territories were organised as a confederation of related noble houses, each controlling discrete territorial units but acknowledging the paramount authority of the king at Din Aidin. Archaeological evidence from subsidiary settlements reveals the presence of fortified manor houses and smaller hill forts that served as the centres of local administration, suggesting a decentralised system that balanced central royal authority with significant regional autonomy. The genealogical traditions preserved in medieval Welsh manuscripts trace the Gododin royal house through multiple generations, revealing a complex web of marriage alliances and kinship connections that linked the dynasty to the ruling families of other northern British kingdoms. These relationships created both opportunities for military cooperation and potential sources of internal conflict, as competing claims to succession could involve supporters from multiple kingdoms. The archaeological record from Din Aidin reveals evidence for substantial modifications to the fortress during the late 6th century, possibly reflecting the need to accommodate expanded royal households resulting from marriage alliances and the presence of allied warriors. The territorial extent of Gododin control encompassed not only the immediate vicinity of Din Aidin, but also substantial portions of the eastern Scottish lowlands, extending from the Firth of Forth southward to the Cheviot Hills. This territory included some of the most fertile agricultural land in northern Britain, with archaeological evidence revealing sophisticated farming systems that could support substantial population concentrations. The presence of numerous small settlements and farmsteads throughout the region indicates intensive agricultural exploitation that provided the economic foundation for the kingdom's military and political activities. The strategic position of the Gododdin territories made them a crucial buffer between the northern British kingdoms and the expanding Northumbrian realm centred at Bamborough. Control of the eastern coastal plain and the major river valleys that provided access to the interior highlands gave the Gododdins significant influence over trade routes and military movements throughout the region. Archaeological evidence from coastal sites reveals the presence of substantial harbour facilities and evidence for maritime trade connections that extended to Ireland, continental Europe, and the Mediterranean world. The military organisation of the Gododdin reflected both the kingdom's strategic position and its political structure as a confederation of noble houses. Each territorial division was expected to provide a specified number of warriors for royal campaigns, with the local lords responsible for equipping and training their contingents according to standardised requirements. Archaeological evidence from weapon hoards and individual finds reveals the sophisticated metallurgical techniques employed in producing the arms and armour that equipped these forces, with particular emphasis on the long swords and elaborate spear points that served as symbols of warrior status. The professional warrior band that served the Gododdin king directly, known in Welsh sources as the Tulu, represented the military elite of the Confederation and formed the core of any major military expedition. These men, numbering perhaps 300 individuals at the height of the kingdom's power, were maintained at royal expense and resided at Din Aidin when not engaged in active campaigning. Excavations at the fortress have uncovered evidence for substantial barracks facilities and training areas that could accommodate this permanent military establishment, along with workshops for maintaining weapons and equipment. The cultural traditions that flourished at the Gododdin court during the late 6th century produced some of the most significant literary achievements in early Welsh literature. The court supported a sophisticated bardic establishment that preserved not only the genealogies and historical traditions essential for political legitimacy, but also created new works celebrating contemporary achievements and maintaining diplomatic relationships with allied kingdoms. The presence of educated clergy and secular scholars at Din Aidin created an intellectual environment that combined Christian learning with traditional Celtic scholarship. The Bard Aneurin emerged as the most celebrated poet associated with the Gododdin court, producing works that would preserve the memory of the kingdom's military culture for centuries after its political collapse. His masterpiece, Why Gododdin, represents one of the earliest substantial works in the Welsh language and provides invaluable insights into the warrior culture, political relationships, and military practices of late 6th century Hen Ogledd. The poem's detailed descriptions of weapons, tactics, and individual warriors correspond closely to archaeological evidence from contemporary sites, confirming its value as a historical source. The gathering of warriors that would culminate in the catastrophe at Caertraeth began as a carefully planned military expedition designed to strike a decisive blow against Northumbrian expansion into traditional British territories. Contemporary sources suggest that the initiative for this campaign came from Mynydog Mwynfawr, the king of the Gododdin, who recognised that the growing power of the Northumbrian kingdom under Aethel Frith posed an existential threat to all the northern British realms. The strategic objective appears to have been the capture or destruction of the Anglo-Saxon stronghold at Caertraeth, modern Catterick in North Yorkshire, which controlled crucial river crossings and road networks in the region. Archaeological evidence from Din Aidin reveals substantial preparations for a major military expedition during the late 6th century, including the construction of additional storage facilities and evidence for the accumulation of large quantities of weapons and supplies. The scale of these preparations suggests an operation involving several hundred warriors, far exceeding the normal size of Gododin military forces and indicating the participation of allied contingents from other northern British kingdoms. The discovery of distinctive artefacts and weapon styles from various regions of Hen Ogledd confirms the multi-kingdom nature of this expedition. The recruitment process for the Cattraeth expedition drew upon the complex web of kinship relationships and political obligations that connected the noble houses of Hen Ogledd. Gododin describes warriors arriving at Din Aidin from throughout the northern British territories, including representatives from Rheged, Strathclyde, Elmet, and various smaller kingdoms and lordships. These men came not as mercenaries but as kinsmen and allies, fulfilling obligations established through generations of intermarriage and mutual support, creating a force that represented the flower of northern British military culture. The poem provides detailed descriptions of individual warriors that reveal the sophisticated social hierarchies and regional identities that characterize the expedition. Warriors are identified not only by their personal names, but also by their territorial origins, family connections, and previous military achievements, creating a complex portrait of early medieval Celtic aristocratic culture. The emphasis placed on personal relationships, kinship bonds, and shared cultural values demonstrates the extent to which political and military organisation in Hen Ogledd depended upon traditional social structures rather than purely administrative systems. The year-long period of preparation and feasting that preceded the expedition served multiple purposes beyond simple military planning. The extended residence of allied warriors at Din Aidin created opportunities for establishing personal relationships, coordinating tactical procedures, and reinforcing the cultural bonds that would be essential for maintaining unit cohesion during combat operations. Archaeological evidence suggests that the royal court was substantially expanded during this period, with temporary accommodation constructed to house the visiting warriors and their retinues. The feasting and ceremonial activities described in Y Gododin reflect the crucial role that hospitality and gift-giving played in maintaining warrior loyalty and motivation. The poem repeatedly emphasises the generosity of Mynydog Mwynfar in providing mead, wine, and elaborate meals for his guests, while also distributing valuable gifts including weapons, jewellery, and horses. These activities serve not only to demonstrate royal wealth and status, but also to create personal obligations that would ensure the warriors' commitment to the upcoming campaign. The tactical planning for the Cattraeth expedition appears to have been based on intelligence regarding the military situation in Northumbria and the specific defences of the target stronghold. Contemporary sources suggest that the expedition was timed to coincide with Aethelfrith's absence on campaign elsewhere, creating an opportunity to strike at a key Northumbrian position when it was potentially undermanned or unprepared. The choice of Cattraeth as the target reflected its strategic importance as a communications hub and supply centre that supported Northumbrian control over the Yorkshire region. The route taken by the Gododin expedition led southward from Din Aidin through the traditional territories of various British kingdoms, following ancient trackways and Roman roads that provided the most direct access to the target area. Archaeological evidence from temporary campsites along this route suggests a well-organised march with appropriate logistical support, including supply trains and arrangements for feeding and sheltering the force during its movement. The size of some of these campsites indicates a substantial military force, possibly numbering 400 or more warriors along with their support personnel. The Battle of Cattraeth itself appears to have resulted from the failure of the original strategic plan, possibly due to the unexpected presence of substantial Northumbrian reinforcements or the discovery of the British approach by enemy scouts. Instead of achieving the surprise attack that had been planned, the Gododin force found itself engaged in a major pitched battle against superior numbers of Anglo-Saxon warriors, fighting on familiar terrain with the advantage of prepared positions. Archaeological evidence from the Catterick area reveal signs of a significant military engagement during this period, including weapon fragments and human remains that suggest intense combat. The tactical details preserved in Y. Gododin indicate that the battle involved sustained fighting over an extended period, with the British forces initially achieving some success before being overwhelmed by enemy numbers. The poem describes individual acts of heroism and the gradual collapse of British resistance as warriors fell around their standards and the formation began to disintegrate. The emphasis on personal combat and individual achievement reflects the warrior culture that dominated northern British military thinking, but also suggests tactical limitations that contributed to the ultimate disaster. The scale of the defeat at Cattraeth represented a catastrophic loss for the northern British kingdoms, with Y. Gododin claiming that only a handful of warriors survived from the original expedition. While poetic exaggeration may have inflated these casualty figures, archaeological evidence and the subsequent political developments in the region confirm that the battle resulted in devastating losses among the military elite of Hen Ogledd. The death of so many experienced warriors and noble leaders created power vacuums throughout the northern kingdoms that would prove impossible to fill effectively. The immediate consequences of the Cattraeth disaster extended far beyond the simple loss of military personnel to encompass fundamental changes in the political balance of power throughout northern Britain. The destruction of the Allied expedition eliminated the most effective military force that the British kingdoms had assembled since Urien's campaigns, removing the primary obstacle to continued Northumbrian expansion. Archaeological evidence from British settlements in the border regions reveals signs of abandonment and destruction during the early 7th century, suggesting rapid territorial losses following the battle. The psychological impact of the defeat proved equally significant, as the destruction of such a prestigious force called into question the military capabilities and political leadership of the northern British kingdoms. The cultural significance of the disaster is reflected in the composition of Y. Gododin itself, which transformed military catastrophe into literary achievement while preserving the memory of the fallen warriors for future generations. The poem's emphasis on honour, loyalty, and heroic death in the face of overwhelming odds created a cultural framework for understanding defeat that would influence Celtic literature for centuries. The political fragmentation that followed the Cattraeth disaster accelerated the decline of coordinated British resistance to Anglo-Saxon expansion. The loss of so many nobles and warriors from multiple kingdoms disrupted the kinship networks and personal relationships that had provided the foundation for inter-kingdom cooperation. Archaeological evidence from major British settlements reveals declining material culture and reduced evidence for long-distance trade connections, suggesting economic as well as political consequences from the military catastrophe. The catastrophic defeat at Cattraeth marked a fundamental turning point in the struggle between the British kingdoms of Hen Ogledd and their Anglo-Saxon neighbours, creating opportunities for territorial expansion that ambitious Northumbrian rulers would exploit with devastating effectiveness. The death of so many British nobles and warriors had shattered the military coordination that had enabled effective resistance during Urien's era, leaving individual kingdoms vulnerable to systematic conquest by increasingly confident Anglo-Saxon forces. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites throughout the border regions reveals the rapid pace of political and demographic change that characterised the first half of the 7th century, as traditional British territories fell under Anglo-Saxon control with alarming regularity. Aethelfrith's ascension to the Northumbrian throne around 593 AD brought to power a ruler whose military capabilities and territorial ambitions would fundamentally reshape the political landscape of northern Britain. Contemporary sources describe him as a warrior king whose strategic vision encompassed not merely defensive consolidation, but aggressive expansion that would establish Northumbrian hegemony over vast territories previously controlled by British kingdoms. Archaeological evidence from Bamborough, the coastal fortress that served as Aethelfrith's primary stronghold, reveals substantial modifications during his reign that transformed the ancient British hill fort into a formidable Anglo-Saxon royal centre, capable of supporting extensive military operations. The fortification works undertaken at Bamborough during this period incorporated sophisticated defensive techniques that combined Anglo-Saxon military engineering with adaptations of existing British fortifications. Excavations have uncovered evidence for massive timber palisades constructed using advanced carpentry techniques, with interlocking post and beam structures that created defensive walls capable of withstanding sustained assault. The discovery of substantial quantities of iron arrowheads, spear points and other military equipment within the fortress complex indicates the presence of well-equipped garrisons that could project military power throughout the surrounding regions. Aethelfrith's military organisation reflected the fusion of traditional Germanic warrior band structures with tactical innovations derived from contact with British and continental European military systems. The professional warrior retinues that formed the core of his military forces were equipped with superior weapons and armour produced in specialised workshops that had been established within major Northumbrian settlements. Archaeological analysis of weapon hoards from this period reveals the use of advanced metallurgical techniques that produced blades of exceptional quality, while the standardisation of equipment types suggests systematic military planning and resource allocation. The strategic objectives that guided Aethelfrith's campaigns extended beyond simple territorial acquisition to encompass the systematic elimination of British political independence throughout northern England. His forces targeted not only major strongholds and royal centres, but also the economic infrastructure that supported British resistance, including agricultural settlements, craft production centres and trade networks. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout Yorkshire and Lancashire reveals patterns of destruction and abandonment that suggest coordinated military operations designed to undermine the material foundations of British power. The conquest of Elmet represented perhaps the most significant of Aethelfrith's early territorial acquisitions, as this kingdom controlled crucial river valleys and mountain passes that connected the northern British territories with potential allies in Wales and the southwest. The royal centre at Barwick-in-Elmet, which had maintained its independence throughout the previous century of Anglo-Saxon expansion, fell to Northumbrian forces around 616 AD, following a systematic campaign that isolated the kingdom from external support. Excavations at the site have revealed evidence for the violent destruction of British defensive works, with burned timber and collapsed stone structures indicating the thoroughness of the Anglo-Saxon assault. The political consequences of Elmet's fall extended far beyond the immediate territorial gains, as the kingdom's strategic position had made it a crucial link in the network of alliances that connected the surviving British realms. Archaeological evidence from settlements throughout the region reveals the rapid replacement of British material culture with Anglo-Saxon artefacts, suggesting not merely political conquest, but substantial demographic change involving the settlement of Germanic populations in formerly British territories. The discovery of Anglo-Saxon burial sites within traditional British settlement areas indicates the establishment of permanent colonial communities that would prevent any future restoration of British control. The transformation of Elmet from an independent British kingdom into a Northumbrian province required sophisticated administrative systems that could integrate the conquered territory into the expanding Anglo-Saxon realm. Archaeological evidence suggests the establishment of new administrative centres at strategic locations throughout the former kingdom, with fortified compounds that served as bases for Northumbrian officials and military garrisons. The presence of specialised workshops producing Anglo-Saxon-style pottery, metalwork and other material goods indicates the systematic replacement of British craft traditions with Germanic cultural practices. The military techniques employed in the conquest of Elmet demonstrated the tactical sophistication that Northumbrian forces had developed through decades of warfare against British opponents. Contemporary sources describe the use of coordinated infantry and cavalry formations that could effectively assault hill-fort defences while preventing the escape of defending forces. Archaeological evidence from siege sites reveals the employment of sophisticated engineering techniques, including the construction of siege works and the use of specialised equipment for breaching fortified positions. The Battle of Degsastan in 603 AD represented a crucial test of Northumbrian military capabilities against a coalition of Scottish and Irish forces led by Aidan mac Gabrian, King of Dalriada. This engagement, fought somewhere in the borderlands between modern Scotland and England, pitted Aethelfrith's expanding kingdom against a formidable alliance that sought to contain Northumbrian power before it could threaten the independence of the northern Celtic realms. Archaeological evidence from potential battle sites in the region reveals signs of major military activity during this period, including weapon deposits and evidence for large-scale troop movements that suggest the substantial scale of this confrontation. The strategic significance of Degsastan extended far beyond its immediate military results, as the battle determined whether Northumbrian expansion would be contained within traditional English territories or would continue northward into the Scottish lowlands. Aidan's decision to intervene directly in Northumbrian affairs reflected the growing recognition among Celtic rulers that Aethelfrith's ambitions posed a threat to the entire network of independent kingdoms that had emerged from the collapse of Roman authority. The coalition forces that assembled for this campaign included not only Dalriadan Scots, but also warriors from various British kingdoms and Irish allies, creating one of the largest Celtic armies assembled during the early 7th century. The tactical arrangements for the Battle of Degsastan appear to have been based on traditional Celtic military practices that emphasised individual warrior prowess and the coordination of kinship-based fighting units. Archaeological evidence from contemporary weapon hoards reveals the sophisticated equipment that armed these forces, including elaborately decorated swords, spears, and shields that proclaimed their owner's status and cultural identity. The presence of Irish-style artefacts among the weapon finds suggests the participation of substantial contingents from across the Irish Sea, indicating the international scope of the alliance against Northumbrian expansion. Aethelfrith's victory at Degsastan demonstrated the tactical superiority that Northumbrian forces had achieved through their systematic military organisation and standardised equipment. Contemporary sources describe the battle as a crushing defeat for the Celtic coalition, with heavy casualties among the Scottish and Irish leadership that would influence political developments throughout the region for decades to come. The death of Aidan's sons and many of his principal nobles effectively ended Dalriadan ambitions to expand into Northumbrian territory while establishing Aethelfrith's reputation as the dominant military leader in northern Britain. The aftermath of Degsastan saw the rapid consolidation of Northumbrian control over territories that had previously served as buffer zones between Anglo-Saxon and Celtic spheres of influence. Archaeological evidence from settlements in the Cheviot Hills and the Upper Tweed Valley reveals the establishment of new Northumbrian administrative centres and the construction of fortified positions that could monitor and control movement across the traditional frontier. The presence of Anglo-Saxon artefacts at sites that had previously produced exclusively British material culture indicates the systematic colonisation of these borderland territories. The political ramifications of the Degsastan victory extended throughout the Celtic world, as news of the defeat undermined confidence in the military capabilities of the traditional kingdoms while encouraging submission to Northumbrian authority. Several smaller British lordships in the border regions appear to have acknowledged Aethelfrith's overlordship following the battle, providing tribute and military service in exchange for protection against rival Celtic rulers. Archaeological evidence from these territories reveals the survival of British material culture alongside the introduction of Anglo-Saxon administrative practices, suggesting accommodation rather than complete cultural replacement. Edwin's succession to the Northumbrian throne in 616 AD, following Aethelfrith's death in battle against the East Anglians, brought to power a ruler whose political vision encompassed the transformation of Northumbria from a regional kingdom into the dominant power throughout northern Britain. Edwin's early experiences as an exile in various Celtic courts had provided him with detailed knowledge of British political systems and military capabilities, information that would prove crucial in planning the campaigns that would complete the conquest of the remaining independent territories. Archaeological evidence from major Northumbrian settlement reveals substantial expansion and fortification projects undertaken during Edwin's reign, indicating the mobilization of resources for sustained military operations. The administrative systems that Edwin established to govern his expanding territories reflected a sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in ruling diverse populations with different cultural traditions and political expectations. The kingdom was divided into distinct administrative units, each governed by appointed officials who were responsible for collecting tribute, maintaining order, and providing military service when required. Archaeological evidence from regional administrative centres reveals the presence of standardised weights, measures, and other administrative tools that facilitated the integration of conquered territories into the Northumbrian governmental system. Edwin's military campaigns against the remaining British kingdoms were characterised by careful planning and systematic execution that reflected both his personal military experience and the institutional capabilities that Northumbria had developed during the previous decades of expansion. The professional military forces that formed the core of his armies were supported by substantial militia levies drawn from the Anglo-Saxon population of the kingdom, creating combined forces capable of conducting multiple simultaneous operations across wide geographical areas. Archaeological evidence from military camps and supply depots reveals the sophisticated logistical systems that supported these extended campaigns. The siege and eventual capture of Din Idin around 638 AD represented the culmination of Edwin's systematic campaign to eliminate the last major centre of British resistance in the southeastern Scottish lowlands. The fortress that had served as the stronghold of the Gododin kingdom for centuries presented formidable defensive challenges, with its position atop a volcanic plug providing natural protection that had been enhanced by generations of fortification work. Archaeological evidence from the site reveals the massive scale of the defensive works that protected the summit, including multiple lines of stone walls and sophisticated water storage systems that could sustain a substantial garrison during extended sieges. The tactical approach that Edwin's forces employed against Din Idin demonstrated the advanced siege techniques that Northumbrian military engineers had developed through decades of warfare against fortified British positions. Contemporary sources describe the construction of elaborate siege works that surrounded the fortress and prevented the delivery of supplies or reinforcements to the defenders. Archaeological investigations have uncovered evidence for substantial earthwork constructions in the areas surrounding the castle rock, including defensive ditches and ramparts that suggest the establishment of permanent siege camps capable of maintaining the blockade for extended periods. The duration of the siege appears to have extended over several months, with the defenders gradually weakened by hunger and disease as their supplies were exhausted and their water sources contaminated. Archaeological evidence from within the fortress reveals signs of desperate measures taken by the besieged population, including the consumption of previously stored grain reserves and the modification of existing buildings to accommodate increased numbers of refugees who had fled to the stronghold for protection. The discovery of hastily buried hoards of valuables suggests that the defenders recognized the inevitability of the fortress's fall and attempted to preserve their wealth for potential future recovery. The final assault on Din Idin appears to have been triggered by the collapse of a section of the defensive wall, possibly due to undermining operations conducted by Northumbrian engineers or the effects of prolonged bombardment with stone-throwing engines. Archaeological evidence reveals signs of intense fighting within the fortress complex, with burned buildings and scattered weapons indicating fierce resistance by the defenders even after the outer defences had been breached. The systematic destruction of British cultural symbols and the construction of new Anglo-Saxon administrative buildings within the fortress complex marked the definitive end of Gododin independence. The fall of Dinaydin eliminated the last major British stronghold capable of coordinating resistance to Northumbrian expansion in the southeastern regions of what would become Scotland. The strategic importance of the fortress's position, controlling the primary overland routes between the Scottish Highlands and the English territories to the south, made its capture essential for the consolidation of Northumbrian control over the entire region. Archaeological evidence from settlements throughout the former Gododin territories reveals the rapid establishment of Anglo-Saxon administrative systems and the settlement of Germanic populations in key strategic locations. The surviving British kingdoms found themselves forced to develop new strategies for maintaining their independence in the face of overwhelming Northumbrian military superiority. Diplomatic accommodation emerged as the primary alternative to military resistance, with several rulers choosing to acknowledge Edwin's overlordship in exchange for the preservation of their territorial integrity and cultural autonomy. Archaeological evidence from these client kingdoms reveals the continuation of traditional British material culture alongside the adoption of certain Anglo-Saxon administrative practices, suggesting successful negotiation of tributary relationships that preserved essential elements of native political organisation. The Kingdom of Strathclyde, protected by the formidable natural defences of Dumbarton Rock and its strategic position, controlling access to the western Scottish Highlands, managed to maintain its independence through a combination of military preparedness and diplomatic flexibility. Archaeological evidence from Altclut reveals substantial fortification work undertaken during this period, including the construction of additional defensive walls and the expansion of storage facilities that could support extended sieges. The kingdom's rulers appear to have avoided direct confrontation with Northumbrian forces while maintaining their territorial integrity through careful neutrality and occasional tributary payments. Marriage alliances became increasingly important tools for British kingdoms seeking to preserve their independence through diplomatic rather than military means. The complex kinship networks that connected the ruling houses of Hen Ogledd were extended to include relationships with Northumbrian nobles, creating personal bonds that could provide protection against conquest while maintaining nominal independence. Archaeological evidence from royal burial sites reveals the exchange of prestigious grave goods between British and Anglo-Saxon elites, suggesting the development of cultural relationships that transcended political boundaries. The economic strategies employed by surviving British kingdoms reflected their reduced political circumstances and the need to accommodate Northumbrian demands for tribute, while maintaining sufficient resources to support their own governmental and military requirements. Archaeological evidence reveals the intensification of agricultural production in areas under British control, with the construction of new field systems and the expansion of cultivation into previously marginal areas. Specialised craft production, particularly metalworking and textile manufacture, provided goods that could be traded for the luxury items and military equipment required by British courts. The cultural consequences of Northumbrian expansion extended far beyond simple political conquest to encompass fundamental changes in the linguistic, religious, and artistic traditions that had defined British identity throughout Hen Ogledd. The systematic replacement of British administrative systems with Anglo-Saxon governmental practices gradually undermined the social structures that had supported traditional Celtic culture, while the settlement of Germanic populations in conquered territories created new demographic realities that would influence regional development for centuries to come. Archaeological evidence reveals the gradual disappearance of distinctively British material culture from many areas that had fallen under Northumbrian control, replaced by standardised Anglo-Saxon artefact types that reflected the cultural preferences of the new ruling elite. The transformation of the political landscape following Edwin's conquests left only scattered remnants of the once mighty confederation of northern British kingdoms. Yet among these survivors, the kingdom of Alt Clwyd, known to later generations as Strathclyde, emerged as the most resilient and enduring of all the Hen Ogledd realms. Perched atop the volcanic plug of Dumbarton Rock, where the River Leven meets the Clyde, this fortress kingdom would demonstrate a remarkable capacity for adaptation and survival that would see it outlast all its contemporaries by several centuries. The strategic advantages that enabled Alt Clwyd's longevity stemmed from both geographical and political factors that distinguished it from its fallen neighbours. The fortress itself, rising 240 feet above the river confluence, presented attackers with virtually insurmountable defensive challenges. Archaeological investigations conducted on the rock have revealed the sophisticated nature of the defensive systems that protected the royal stronghold. Multiple defensive walls followed the natural contours of the volcanic formation, creating successive defensive zones that could be held independently if outer positions were compromised. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence for elaborate water collection and storage systems carved directly into the rock, including cisterns capable of holding thousands of gallons that could sustain the garrison through extended sieges. The kingdom's territorial control extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of the fortress to encompass the fertile Clyde Valley and its tributaries, providing agricultural resources that could support a substantial population. Archaeological surveys of settlement sites throughout the region reveal evidence for intensive agricultural exploitation during the 7th century, with field systems and farmsteads that employed sophisticated drainage techniques to maximize productivity in the often waterlogged valley bottoms. The presence of substantial grain storage facilities at sites like Govan and Partick indicates the development of agricultural surpluses that could support non-agricultural populations and provide resources for trade with neighbouring regions. The rulers of Alt Clwyd demonstrated exceptional diplomatic skills in navigating the complex political relationships that emerged following the collapse of traditional British power structures. Rather than pursuing futile military resistance against overwhelming Northumbrian superiority, they developed a flexible approach that combined strategic accommodation with careful maintenance of their essential independence. Contemporary sources suggest that the kingdom occasionally provided tribute or military assistance to Northumbrian overlords when circumstances demanded, while simultaneously maintaining relationships with Pictish, Irish, and surviving British rulers that preserved their options for future political realignments. Marriage alliances played a crucial role in this diplomatic strategy, with the royal house of Alt Clwyd establishing kinship connections that extended throughout the Celtic world and occasionally into Anglo-Saxon nobility. Archaeological evidence from royal burial sites reveals the exchange of prestigious grave goods that reflected these wide-ranging political relationships, including Irish style brooches, Pictish symbol stones, and occasionally Anglo-Saxon metalwork that demonstrate the kingdom's integration into multiple political networks simultaneously. These marriages created complex webs of obligation and mutual support that provided protection against potential aggressors while maintaining the cultural distinctiveness that defined Strathclyde identity. The economic foundations that supported Alt Clwyd's continued independence required constant adaptation to changing political circumstances and new commercial opportunities. The kingdom's position controlling access to the western Scottish Highlands made it a crucial intermediary in trade relationships between the Irish Sea regions and the emerging centres of Anglo-Saxon power in southern Scotland and northern England. Archaeological evidence from harbour sites along the Clyde reveals the presence of substantial port facilities capable of handling large vessels, while the discovery of imported goods from Ireland, Wales and continental Europe demonstrates the kingdom's integration into long-distance trade networks. Metalworking industries flourished under royal patronage, producing both utilitarian goods for local consumption and luxury items that could be traded for exotic imports or used as diplomatic gifts. Excavations at Gavan have uncovered evidence for sophisticated iron and bronze working facilities that employed advanced techniques for producing high-quality weapons, tools, and decorative objects. The presence of specialised workshops within the royal complex at Dumbarton Rock indicates direct royal control over the production of the most prestigious items, ensuring that the kingdom's rulers could maintain the material displays of wealth and power necessary for effective political leadership. The survival of Reged as an independent political entity became increasingly precarious following the devastating losses at Catraeth and the subsequent Northumbrian conquests that eliminated most of its traditional allies. Archaeological evidence from Carlisle reveals significant changes in the character of royal occupation during the mid-7th century, with modifications to existing structures that suggest adaptation to reduced circumstances and altered political realities. The great timber halls that had accommodated Urien's extensive warrior retinues were subdivided into smaller units, while new construction emphasized defensive capabilities over ceremonial grandeur. The territorial extent of Reged underwent dramatic contraction as Northumbrian pressure intensified and local populations either fled or submitted to Anglo-Saxon authority. Archaeological surveys of settlement sites throughout the traditional heartland of the kingdom reveal patterns of abandonment and reoccupation that suggest substantial demographic disruption during this period. Many hill forts and fortified settlements show evidence of hasty abandonment, with valuable items left behind and defensive works deliberately slighted to prevent their use by enemies. The replacement populations that eventually reoccupied some of these sites often displayed material culture that reflected Anglo-Saxon rather than British cultural preferences. The final phases of Reged's independence appear to have involved a gradual process of territorial concession and political accommodation rather than dramatic military conquest. Contemporary sources suggest that successive rulers were forced to acknowledge Northumbrian overlordship in exchange for the preservation of limited autonomy over their remaining territories. Archaeological evidence from administrative sites reveals the introduction of Anglo-Saxon governmental practices alongside the survival of traditional British legal and social institutions, creating hybrid systems that reflected the complex political relationships between conqueror and conquered. The incorporation of Reged's remnant territories into the expanding Northumbrian kingdom occurred through a combination of direct annexation and the establishment of client relationships that preserve the appearance of native rule while ensuring effective Anglo-Saxon control. Several members of the Reged royal house appear to have been granted positions within the Northumbrian administrative hierarchy, allowing them to maintain their social status while serving the interests of their former enemies. Archaeological evidence from their residences reveals the adoption of Anglo-Saxon material culture alongside the preservation of certain British cultural symbols, suggesting successful adaptation to changed political circumstances. Christianity emerged as a crucial factor in the political legitimacy and cultural survival of the remaining British kingdoms during this period of territorial contraction and political subordination. The establishment of monasteries and the patronage of religious institutions provided alternative sources of authority and cultural continuity that could survive political conquest and demographic change. Archaeological investigations at early Christian sites throughout the region reveal substantial investment in religious infrastructure during the 7th century, with elaborate stone churches and monastic complexes that demonstrated both royal piety and the economic resources available to surviving British rulers. The monastery at Whithorn, traditionally associated with St Ninian's mission to the southern Picts, became a particularly important centre for the preservation and transmission of British Christian culture. Excavations at the site have revealed evidence for continuous occupation throughout the 7th century, with substantial stone buildings and evidence for sophisticated scriptural and artistic production. The presence of carved stone monuments bearing Latin inscriptions and Celtic artistic motifs demonstrates the synthesis of Christian learning with traditional British cultural expressions that characterised religious life in the surviving kingdoms. Monastic communities served multiple functions beyond their purely religious roles, acting as centres of learning, economic production, and political influence that could provide stability during periods of political upheaval. The monks and clergy associated with these institutions often possessed the literacy and administrative skills necessary for effective governance, making them valuable advisors to secular rulers and intermediaries in diplomatic negotiations. Archaeological evidence from monastic sites reveals the presence of substantial libraries, scriptoria, and educational facilities that preserved not only religious texts, but also historical chronicles, legal documents, and literary works that maintained cultural memory across generations. The cult of British saints provided particularly important sources of political legitimacy and cultural identity for the surviving kingdoms. Saints like Kentigern in Strathclyde and Patrick in Ireland became focal points for regional identity that transcended immediate political boundaries while providing spiritual authority that could rival or complement secular kingship. Archaeological evidence from pilgrimage sites reveals substantial investment in shrine construction and the development of religious festivals that attracted visitors from throughout the Celtic world, creating networks of cultural exchange that maintained connections between scattered British communities. The preservation of traditional legal systems within Christianized frameworks allowed British communities to maintain essential elements of their cultural identity, even under foreign political control. Canon law and Christian moral teaching were integrated with ancient Celtic legal traditions to create hybrid systems that preserved customary practices while adapting to new religious requirements. Archaeological evidence from legal assembly sites reveals the continuation of traditional judicial procedures, with stone circles and other ceremonial spaces that had been used for legal proceedings since prehistoric times continuing to serve similar functions under Christian auspices. The material culture that developed in the surviving British kingdoms during this period reflected the complex cultural negotiations required for survival in a changing political landscape. Archaeological assemblages from major sites reveal the continuation of traditional British craft techniques, alongside the selective adoption of Anglo-Saxon and continental European innovations that enhanced economic productivity or political prestige. Pottery production, for example, maintained distinctive regional styles while incorporating new decorative motifs and functional forms that reflected changing consumer preferences and trade relationships. Metalworking traditions demonstrated particular continuity with earlier British practices, as the production of weapons, jewellery and ceremonial objects required specialised knowledge that was closely guarded within craft communities. Archaeological analysis of metalwork from this period reveals the persistence of traditional Celtic artistic styles, with intricate knotwork patterns and zoomorphic designs that maintained cultural distinctiveness while adapting to new political contexts. The presence of Christian symbols integrated into traditional decorative schemes demonstrates the successful synthesis of religious and cultural identities that characterise British adaptation to changing circumstances. Textile production, though poorly preserved in the archaeological record, appears to have maintained traditional patterns and techniques that served as important markers of cultural identity. References in contemporary sources to distinctive British clothing styles and the continued production of high-quality woolen goods suggest that textile crafts provided both economic resources and cultural continuity for surviving British communities. The discovery of specialised textile tools and evidence for sheep farming throughout the region indicates the continued importance of this industry for both local consumption and long-distance trade. The linguistic landscape of the surviving British territories underwent gradual but significant changes during this period, as political pressure and demographic shifts influenced patterns of language use and cultural transmission. While British languages continue to be spoken in domestic and religious contexts, the adoption of Latin for administrative and scholarly purposes and the increasing influence of Anglo-Saxon political terminology created multilingual environments that reflected the complex cultural negotiations required for survival. Archaeological evidence for the continued use of British place names alongside the introduction of Anglo-Saxon administrative terminology suggests the persistence of native geographical knowledge and local cultural traditions. Educational systems within the surviving kingdoms adapted to serve both traditional cultural preservation and the practical requirements of political accommodation with Anglo-Saxon overlords. Monastic schools provided instruction in Latin literacy and Christian theology, while maintaining oral traditions that preserved British historical memory and genealogical knowledge. Archaeological evidence from educational institutions reveals the presence of sophisticated libraries and scriptoria that produced manuscripts in multiple languages, demonstrating the intellectual sophistication that characterized these communities despite their reduced political circumstances. The archaeological record from this period reveals remarkable continuity in settlement patterns and cultural practices, despite the dramatic political changes that affected the region. Many farmsteads and rural communities continue to operate using traditional techniques and social organizations, suggesting that the impact of political conquest was often limited to the replacement of elite leadership rather than fundamental changes in everyday life. The persistence of traditional field systems, building techniques, and subsistence strategies indicates the resilience of rural communities and their capacity to adapt to changing political circumstances while maintaining essential elements of their cultural identity. Trade relationships during this period required careful navigation of complex political boundaries and competing loyalties. The surviving British kingdoms sought to maintain commercial connections while avoiding conflicts with their Anglo-Saxon neighbours. Archaeological evidence reveals the continued circulation of goods between British territories and their traditional trading partners in Ireland, Wales, and continental Europe, alongside the development of new commercial relationships with Anglo-Saxon merchants and administrators. The presence of mixed artefact assemblages at trading sites demonstrates the pragmatic approach that characterized commercial relationships during this transitional period. The preservation of historical memory across the northern British kingdoms relied fundamentally upon the sophisticated oral traditions maintained by professional court poets known as beardí, whose responsibilities extended far beyond mere entertainment to encompass the crucial functions of legitimizing royal authority, preserving genealogical knowledge, and maintaining the cultural identity that bound together the scattered communities of Hen Ogledd. These bardic practitioners operated within institutional frameworks that combined ancient Celtic learning traditions with adaptations necessitated by the political upheavals and territorial losses that characterized the post-Roman period. Archaeological evidence from major royal centres reveals the physical infrastructure that supported bardic activities, including specialised performance spaces within great halls, and evidence for the production and storage of the musical instruments that accompanied poetic recitation. The professional training required to become a recognised bard involved decades of intensive study that encompassed not only the memorisation of vast quantities of traditional material, but also the mastery of complex metrical systems, genealogical knowledge, and legal precedents that form the foundation of Celtic scholarly tradition. Contemporary sources suggest that bardic education followed standardized curricula, that were maintained across multiple kingdoms, ensuring consistency in the preservation and transmission of cultural knowledge despite political fragmentation. Archaeological investigations at sites associated with bardic training have uncovered evidence for substantial libraries and educational facilities, including writing materials and manuscript fragments that demonstrate the integration of oral and written learning traditions. The court poets who served the rulers of Rhaeged, Strathclyde and the other northern kingdoms possessed detailed knowledge of genealogical relationships that extended back through multiple generations, connecting contemporary royal houses to legendary figures and ancient tribal leaders whose authority provided legitimacy for current political claims. These genealogies served multiple functions beyond simple record-keeping, establishing the legal foundations for territorial control, succession rights, and inter-kingdom relationships that governed political interactions throughout Hen Ogledd. The accuracy of genealogical information preserved in bardic tradition has been confirmed through archaeological evidence, from burial sites and contemporary inscriptions that verify the historical existence of many individuals mentioned in the oral traditions. The composition and performance of praise poetry represented perhaps the most visible aspect of bardic activity, as these elaborate verbal constructions celebrated the achievements of living rulers while establishing their place within the broader historical narrative of British resistance to foreign conquest. The poems attributed to Taliesin, particularly those celebrating Urien of Rhaeged, demonstrate the sophisticated literary techniques employed by court poets to create works that functioned simultaneously as entertainment, political propaganda, and historical record. Archaeological evidence from performance contexts reveals the elaborate ceremonial arrangements that accompanied the recitation of these works, with raised platforms, specialized seating arrangements, and acoustic features designed to enhance the impact of poetic presentation. The metrical structures employed in early Welsh poetry reflect the preservation of ancient Indo-European verse traditions that had been adapted to serve the specific requirements of Celtic court culture. Analysis of surviving poems reveals complex patterns of alliteration, internal rhyme, and syllabic counting that required exceptional skill to master and created mnemonic frameworks that facilitated accurate transmission across generations. The consistency of these metrical patterns across different kingdoms and time periods suggests the existence of standardized training methods that maintained technical excellence while allowing for individual creative expression within established formal constraints. The historical reliability of bardic sources presents complex challenges for modern scholars attempting to distinguish between authentic historical information and legendary material that was incorporated into the oral tradition over time. Contemporary archaeological evidence confirms the accuracy of many specific details preserved in bardic poetry, including descriptions of weapons, fortifications, and military tactics that correspond closely to physical remains from relevant sites and periods. However, the integration of mythological elements and the tendency toward heroic exaggeration that characterize praise poetry requires careful analysis to extract reliable historical information from the literary embellishments that serve the poet's artistic and political purposes. The process by which bardic traditions were eventually committed to writing occurred primarily in Wales during the medieval period, when scribes working in monastic scriptoria began recording the oral traditions that had been preserved by successive generations of poets and storytellers. The manuscripts that contain these materials, including the Book of Aneurin, the Book of Taliesin, and various collections of genealogical and historical texts, represent the culmination of centuries of oral transmission that had maintained the cultural memory of Hen Ogledd, despite the political collapse of the northern kingdoms. Archaeological evidence from the scriptoria where these manuscripts were produced reveals the sophisticated intellectual infrastructure that supported this preservation effort, including substantial libraries, specialized writing materials, and evidence for the scholarly networks that connected Welsh monasteries with other centres of Celtic learning. The transmission of Northern British cultural memory to Wales involved complex processes of adaptation and reinterpretation that reflected the different political and social circumstances of the receiving communities. Welsh scholars and poets who recorded these traditions were often working centuries after the original events, requiring them to reconcile conflicting versions of stories and to interpret archaic language and cultural references that had become obscure through the passage of time. The archaeological record from Welsh monastic sites reveals evidence for sustained scholarly activity during the periods when these manuscripts were being produced, including the presence of multiple scribal hands and evidence for the comparison and collation of different textual sources. The development of Welsh literary tradition during the medieval period drew heavily upon the preserved memories of Hen Ogledd, while adapting these materials to serve the political and cultural needs of contemporary Welsh society. The four branches of the Mabinogi, while primarily reflecting Southern Welsh cultural traditions, incorporate certain elements that may derive from Northern British sources, though these connections remain tenuous and difficult to verify through archaeological evidence. The process of literary development involved the creative transformation of historical memories into new narrative forms that served the entertainment and educational requirements of medieval Welsh courts while preserving essential elements of the older traditions. The role of genealogical poetry in legitimizing royal dynasties throughout the Celtic world required bardic practitioners to maintain detailed knowledge of kinship relationships that extended across multiple kingdoms and generations. These genealogies served as legal documents that established claims to territorial control, succession rights, and political authority that could be invoked during disputes or succession crises. Archaeological evidence from royal burial sites confirms the accuracy of many genealogical claims preserved in bardic tradition, with grave goods and burial practices that reflect the social status and cultural affiliations described in the oral sources. The preservation of military traditions within bardic poetry provides valuable insights into the warrior culture that dominated northern British society during the 6th and 7th centuries. Detailed descriptions of weapons, tactics, and battlefield behaviour preserved in works like Y Gododin correspond closely to archaeological evidence from weapon hoards and fortification sites, confirming the historical accuracy of much of this material while revealing the cultural values that shaped military conduct. The emphasis placed on individual heroism, loyalty to kinship groups, and the pursuit of honourable death in battle reflects broader social ideals that influenced political relationships and legal systems throughout Hen Ogledd. The integration of Christian elements into traditional bardic material reveals the complex cultural negotiations that occurred as the northern British kingdoms adapted to the spread of the new religion. Archaeological evidence from early Christian sites demonstrates the synthesis of traditional Celtic artistic motifs with Christian symbolism, while manuscript evidence shows the incorporation of Christian moral teaching into traditional narrative frameworks. The preservation of pre-Christian mythological elements alongside Christian materials suggests that bardic practitioners successfully adapted their traditions to serve the requirements of Christianized courts while maintaining essential elements of older cultural systems. The geographic knowledge preserved in bardic tradition includes detailed information about the territorial boundaries, settlement patterns, and strategic locations that characterise the political landscape of Hen Ogledd during its period of independence. Place names mentioned in early Welsh poetry can often be correlated with archaeological sites that show evidence of occupation during the relevant periods, confirming the historical accuracy of much topographical information while providing valuable insights into the political geography of the northern kingdoms. The preservation of archaic place names that had fallen out of common use by the time the traditions were written down demonstrates the remarkable accuracy of oral transmission over extended periods. The social functions served by bardic performance extended beyond the immediate entertainment of court audiences to encompass broader community education and cultural reinforcement that maintained group identity during periods of political stress. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites reveals the presence of performance spaces within both elite and non-elite contexts, suggesting that bardic traditions operated at multiple social levels and served diverse community needs. The standardization of certain narrative elements across different social contexts indicates the role of professional bards in maintaining cultural coherence while allowing for local variations that reflected specific community interests and concerns. The economic support systems that sustained bardic activity required substantial resource allocation from royal and noble patrons who recognized the political and cultural value of maintaining these traditions. Contemporary sources describe the material rewards provided to successful poets, including grants of land, livestock, and precious objects that ensured their economic security, while demonstrating the patron's wealth and cultural sophistication. Archaeological evidence from high-status residences reveals the presence of specialized accommodation for visiting bards and the storage facilities required for the musical instruments and other equipment associated with their performances. The relationship between bardic tradition and legal systems throughout the Celtic world involved the preservation of customary law and precedent that governed social relationships and political authority. Bards served as repositories of legal knowledge who could be consulted during disputes or called upon to verify the legitimacy of particular claims or procedures. Archaeological evidence from legal assembly sites reveals the ceremonial contexts in which this knowledge was applied, with stone circles and other formal spaces that had been used for judicial proceedings since prehistoric times continuing to serve similar functions under the guidance of bardic legal experts. The influence of bardic tradition on the development of written literature throughout the medieval Celtic world extended far beyond the simple recording of existing oral materials to encompass the creation of new literary forms that combine traditional narrative techniques with innovations derived from contact with Latin scholarly traditions. The sophisticated manuscript culture that developed in Welsh monasteries during the medieval period drew upon both indigenous Celtic learning traditions and continental European scholarly methods, creating hybrid intellectual systems that preserved ancient cultural knowledge while adapting to contemporary educational requirements. The archaeological evidence for the material culture associated with bardic performance includes the remains of musical instruments, specialized furniture, and decorative objects that enhance the ceremonial aspects of poetic presentation. Excavations at royal sites have uncovered fragments of harps, lyres, and other stringed instruments that provided musical accompaniment for poetic recitation, while the discovery of elaborate drinking vessels and ceremonial objects demonstrates the integration of bardic performance into broader patterns of elite hospitality and social display. The craftsmanship evident in these artifacts reflects the high status accorded to bardic practitioners and the substantial resources devoted to supporting their activities. The preservation of historical memory through bardic tradition required constant adaptation to changing political circumstances and audience expectations, as poets needed to maintain the relevance of ancient materials while serving the immediate needs of contemporary patrons. The process of tradition maintenance involved the selective emphasis of particular elements while allowing others to fade from active use, creating dynamic systems of cultural transmission that preserved essential historical information while adapting to new social and political contexts. Archaeological evidence from different periods reveals the changing material culture associated with bardic performance, reflecting broader cultural transformations while maintaining essential continuities with earlier traditions. The arrival of Viking longships along the coasts of northern Britain during the late 8th century introduced a new and devastating variable into the already complex political landscape of the surviving British kingdoms. These Norse raiders, emerging from the fjords of Norway and the islands of Denmark, possessed maritime capabilities and military technologies that would fundamentally alter the strategic calculations of rulers throughout the region. The first recorded Viking attack on the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793 AD sent shockwaves through the Christian communities of northern Britain, demonstrating the vulnerability of coastal settlements to seaborne assaults and heralding the beginning of a new age of warfare that would test the survival capabilities of every remaining kingdom. Archaeological evidence from coastal sites throughout Scotland and northern England reveals the sudden appearance of Scandinavian material culture during the early 9th century, including distinctive brooches, weapons, and pottery that indicate not merely raiding activity, but the establishment of permanent settlements. The discovery of ship burials at sites like Skar in Orkney and the presence of Norse-style buildings at locations such as Jarlshof in Shetland demonstrate the scale of Scandinavian colonisation that accompanied the initial raiding phase. These settlements served as bases for further expansion and provided the logistical infrastructure necessary to support sustained military operations against the indigenous British and Pictish populations. The kingdom of Alclut faced its greatest existential crisis in 870 AD, when a massive Viking fleet commanded by the Norse leaders Olaf and Ivar sailed up the River Clyde and laid siege to the fortress of Dumbarton Rock. Contemporary sources describe this as one of the most formidable military operations of the Viking Age, involving a fleet of over 200 ships and several thousand warriors drawn from Norse settlements throughout Ireland and the Scottish Islands. The siege lasted 4 months, during which the attackers employed sophisticated engineering techniques to overcome the natural defences that had protected the fortress for centuries. The Viking assault on Alclut represented a departure from typical Norse raiding tactics, which generally favoured rapid strikes against poorly defended targets, followed by immediate withdrawal with captured wealth and prisoners. The decision to commit substantial resources to a prolonged siege operation against one of the strongest fortifications in northern Britain reflected the strategic importance that the Norse commanders placed on controlling the Clyde Valley and its approaches to the western Scottish Highlands. Archaeological evidence from the siege period reveals the construction of substantial earthwork fortifications around the base of Dumbarton Rock, indicating the Vikings' intention to maintain their position regardless of the time required to reduce the fortress. The defenders of Alclut, led by King Artgal, initially relied upon the fortress's traditional advantages of elevation, water supply, and stored provisions to outlast the besiegers. Archaeological investigations have revealed evidence for the hasty construction of additional defensive works during this period, including the blocking of certain access routes and the reinforcement of existing walls with timber palisades. The discovery of large quantities of iron arrowheads and spear points within the fortress complex suggests that the defenders possessed substantial military equipment and were prepared for extended resistance. The eventual fall of Dumbarton Rock occurred not through direct assault, but through the systematic degradation of the defenders' capacity to maintain resistance. The Vikings' control of the surrounding territory prevented the delivery of supplies or reinforcements, while their naval supremacy eliminated any possibility of relief from seaborne allies. Archaeological evidence suggests that the fortress's water supply, normally adequate for its garrison, became insufficient to support the expanded population of refugees who had sought protection within its walls. The discovery of human remains showing signs of malnutrition and disease indicates the desperate conditions that prevailed during the final stages of the siege. The capture of Alclut marked a watershed moment in the history of the northern British kingdoms, as the fall of this supposedly impregnable fortress demonstrated that no traditional defensive position could guarantee security against Viking assault. The systematic destruction of the fortress's defensive works and the enslavement of its population sent a clear message to other British rulers about the consequences of resistance. Contemporary sources report that the Vikings departed with over 200 ships loaded with captives destined for the slave markets of Dublin and other Norse trading centres, representing one of the largest forced population transfers of the early medieval period. The immediate aftermath of the siege saw the temporary collapse of organised British authority throughout the Clyde Valley, as local nobles either fled to more secure territories or submitted to Viking overlordship. Archaeological evidence from settlements throughout the region reveals patterns of abandonment and destruction that suggest widespread social disruption following the fall of the royal fortress. Many hill forts and fortified manor houses show evidence of hasty evacuation, with valuable items left behind and defensive works deliberately slighted to prevent their use by enemies. The survival of the Strathclyde kingdom following this catastrophic defeat required fundamental adaptations to the new military and political realities created by Viking expansion. The royal court, deprived of its traditional stronghold, was forced to establish new centres of authority at more defensible locations, while developing strategies for coexistence with the Norse settlers who had established themselves throughout the Western Islands and coastal regions. Archaeological evidence suggests that the kingdom's administrative centre was relocated to Govan, where substantial ecclesiastical and secular buildings were constructed during the late 9th century. The reconstruction of Strathclyde political authority involved the careful cultivation of relationships with multiple competing powers, including not only the various Viking factions, but also the expanding Scottish kingdom of Alba and the surviving British territories in Wales. King Run, who appears to have assumed leadership following Argyll's death during the siege, demonstrated remarkable diplomatic flexibility in navigating these complex relationships, while gradually rebuilding his kingdom's military capabilities. Contemporary sources suggest that Strathclyde occasionally provided military assistance to Viking expeditions against common enemies, while simultaneously maintaining connections with other Celtic rulers who opposed Norse expansion. The integration of Viking military techniques and technologies into Strathclyde's defensive systems represented a crucial adaptation that enabled the kingdom's survival during this turbulent period. Archaeological evidence from fortification sites reveals the adoption of Scandinavian construction methods alongside traditional British defensive techniques, creating hybrid systems that combine the best features of both traditions. The presence of Norse-style weapons and equipment at British sites indicates either direct adoption of Viking military technology or the employment of Scandinavian mercenaries within British military forces. The economic strategies that enabled Strathclyde's recovery involved the development of new trade relationships that took advantage of the commercial networks established by Viking settlers throughout the Irish Sea region. Archaeological evidence from trading sites along the Clyde reveals the presence of Scandinavian merchants alongside traditional British and Irish traders, suggesting the successful integration of Norse commercial practices with existing Celtic exchange systems. The kingdom's position controlling access to the Scottish Highlands made it a valuable partner for Viking traders seeking to exploit the region's natural resources, particularly iron ore and precious metals. The religious dimensions of Strathclyde's survival strategy involved the careful balance of traditional Christian practices with accommodation to the religious preferences of pagan Viking settlers. Archaeological evidence from ecclesiastical sites reveals the continuation of Christian worship alongside the presence of Scandinavian religious artifacts, suggesting the development of syncretic practices that allowed for peaceful coexistence between different religious communities. The monastery at Govan became particularly important during this period, serving as a centre for diplomatic negotiations and cultural exchange between British and Norse populations. The demographic changes that accompanied Viking settlement in western Scotland created new social dynamics that required careful management by Strathclyde's rulers. Archaeological evidence suggests that Norse colonists established farming communities throughout the region, often in areas that had previously been sparsely populated or abandoned following earlier conflicts. The interaction between these new settlers and the existing British population appears to have been generally peaceful, with evidence for intermarriage and cultural exchange that created mixed communities combining elements of both traditions. The military innovations that emerged from the interaction between British and Viking warfare techniques included the development of new tactical approaches that combined traditional Celtic fighting methods with Scandinavian naval capabilities. Archaeological evidence from weapon hoards reveals the presence of hybrid weapon types that incorporated design elements from both cultures, while fortification sites show the adoption of Viking shipyard facilities alongside traditional British defensive works. The ability to project military power through both land and sea operations became crucial for maintaining territorial control in an environment where Viking raiders could strike without warning from any direction. The political structures that evolved in post-Viking Strathclyde reflected the need to accommodate diverse populations with different cultural traditions and political expectations. The kingdom developed administrative systems that allowed for considerable local autonomy while maintaining central coordination for military and diplomatic purposes. Archaeological evidence from regional administrative centres reveals the presence of both British and Scandinavian legal traditions, suggesting the development of hybrid governmental systems that drew upon multiple cultural sources. The cultural synthesis that emerged from the interaction between British and Viking populations in Strathclyde created new artistic and literary traditions that combined elements from both cultures. Archaeological evidence reveals the presence of distinctive sculptural styles that incorporated Scandinavian artistic motifs with traditional Celtic designs, while manuscript evidence suggests the development of new literary forms that drew upon both Norse and British narrative traditions. The famous Govan stones, carved during this period, demonstrate the sophisticated artistic achievements that resulted from this cultural fusion. The territorial extent of the reconstituted Strathclyde kingdom was necessarily more limited than its predecessor, as Viking settlements had permanently altered the demographic and political landscape of Western Scotland. Archaeological surveys reveal that British political control was gradually re-established over the core territories of the Clyde Valley, while accepting Norse dominance in the Western Islands and certain coastal regions. This territorial arrangement created a complex patchwork of overlapping jurisdictions that required constant diplomatic management to maintain stability. The succession arrangements that governed royal authority in post-Viking Strathclyde reflected the need to balance traditional Celtic inheritance practices with the political realities created by foreign settlement and demographic change. Archaeological evidence from royal burial sites suggests the adoption of certain Scandinavian ceremonial practices, alongside the maintenance of traditional British royal symbolism. The integration of Norse noble families into the Strathclyde political hierarchy through marriage alliances created new kinship networks that strengthened the kingdom's position while potentially complicating succession disputes. The defensive strategies developed by Strathclyde during the Viking Age emphasized mobility and flexibility rather than reliance on fixed fortifications that could be besieged and captured. Archaeological evidence reveals the construction of numerous smaller strongholds throughout the kingdom's territory, each capable of supporting limited garrisons, but designed primarily to provide temporary refuge and coordination points for mobile military forces. This distributed defensive system proved more effective against Viking raiding tactics than the traditional concentration of resources in single major fortresses. The economic recovery that followed Strathclyde's initial adaptation to Viking presence involved the exploitation of new, commercial opportunities created by Scandinavian trade networks. Archaeological evidence from market sites reveals the circulation of silver coins and hack silver that reflected the Viking preference for weight-based monetary systems, alongside the continued use of traditional Celtic exchange mechanisms. The kingdom's rulers successfully positioned themselves as intermediaries in trade relationships between Viking merchants and the producers of highland resources, generating revenues that supported political reconstruction and military modernisation. The relationship between Strathclyde and the emerging Scottish Kingdom of Alba became increasingly important as both realms sought to maintain their independence while accommodating Viking expansion. Archaeological evidence suggests regular diplomatic contact between the two kingdoms, with the exchange of prestigious gifts and the coordination of military responses to common threats. The marriage of Strathclyde nobles into the Scottish royal house created kinship connections that would eventually lead to the kingdom's peaceful incorporation into the expanding Scottish realm, though this process would not be completed until the early 11th century. The gradual absorption of Strathclyde into the expanding Scottish kingdom during the early 11th century marked the end of the last independent British realm in northern Scotland, yet this political transformation occurred through negotiated succession rather than military conquest. When King Malcolm III of Scotland inherited Strathclyde through his marriage connections, around 1034 AD, the integration process preserved many existing administrative structures while incorporating the kingdom's territories into the broader Scottish governmental system. Archaeological evidence from Govan and other former Strathclyde centres reveals continuity in settlement patterns and material culture that suggests the transition was managed to minimise disruption to establish communities and economic relationships. The administrative integration of former Strathclyde territories into the Scottish Kingdom required sophisticated governmental systems that could accommodate diverse populations with different legal traditions and cultural expectations. The Scottish Crown established regional lordships that combined elements of traditional Celtic territorial organisation with feudal principles derived from Anglo-Norman administrative practice. Archaeological investigations at sites like Rutherglen and Hamilton reveal the construction of new administrative centres during the late 11th and early 12th centuries, with substantial stone buildings that housed royal officials and provided facilities for regional governance. The preservation of Strathclyde's distinctive cultural identity within the expanding Scottish realm reflected deliberate policies that recognised the value of maintaining local traditions while ensuring political loyalty to the Scottish Crown. The continuation of Gaelic and Cumbric languages in former Strathclyde territories is documented through place name evidence and occasional written sources that demonstrate the survival of indigenous linguistic traditions well into the medieval period. Archaeological evidence from ecclesiastical sites reveals the maintenance of traditional Celtic Christian practices alongside the introduction of continental European religious reforms, creating syncretic religious systems that preserved essential elements of local spiritual traditions. The transformation of political memory surrounding the northern British kingdoms occurred gradually as the immediate practical concerns of governance gave way to romanticised recollections that emphasised heroic resistance and cultural achievement rather than the complex realities of political adaptation and survival. The development of Scottish national identity during the medieval period incorporated certain elements of northern British heritage, while subordinating these traditions to narratives that emphasise Scottish political unity and independence from English influence. Archaeological evidence from royal centres like Scone and Edinburgh reveals the deliberate incorporation of symbols and artefacts associated with earlier British kingdoms into Scottish royal ceremonial, suggesting conscious efforts to claim legitimacy through connection to pre-existing political traditions. The preservation and transformation of Hen Ogledd cultural memory in medieval Welsh literature represented perhaps the most significant legacy of the northern British kingdoms, as Welsh scholars and poets maintained detailed knowledge of northern traditions long after the political collapse of the original realms. The scribes working in Welsh monasteries during the 12th and 13th centuries possessed access to oral traditions and written sources that preserved authentic historical information about the northern kingdoms, though this material was inevitably filtered through the cultural perspectives and political concerns of medieval Welsh society. The manuscripts produced during this period, including the Black Book of Carmarthen and the Red Book of Hergest, contain substantial collections of poetry and prose that celebrate the achievements of northern British heroes while adapting their stories to serve contemporary Welsh cultural and political needs. The figure of Arthur emerged as a central organising principle for Welsh memories of northern British resistance to Anglo-Saxon expansion, though the historical connections between the legendary king and the actual rulers of Hen Ogledd remain complex and contested. Archaeological evidence provides no direct confirmation for Arthur's historical existence, yet the geographical settings and cultural context described in early Arthurian literature correspond closely to the political landscape of 6th century northern Britain. The association of Arthur with specific locations throughout the former territories of Rheged and the Gododdin suggests that Welsh traditions preserved genuine historical memories of military leadership and political organisation in the northern kingdoms, even if these memories became attached to a legendary figure whose actual existence cannot be verified through contemporary sources. The development of Arthurian romance during the medieval period drew heavily upon Welsh traditions about the northern British kingdoms, while transforming these materials to serve the entertainment and cultural needs of continental European audiences. The works of Geoffrey of Monmouth, Chrétien de Troyes, and other medieval authors incorporated elements derived from authentic northern British traditions into elaborate fictional narratives that emphasised chivalric values and courtly culture rather than the harsh realities of early medieval warfare and political survival. Archaeological evidence from medieval courts throughout Europe reveals the popularity of Arthurian themes in decorative arts and ceremonial objects, demonstrating the widespread cultural influence of stories that ultimately derived from the historical experiences of Hen Ogledd. The preservation of genealogical traditions connecting medieval Welsh royal houses to the rulers of the northern British kingdoms served important political functions in legitimising territorial claims and establishing diplomatic relationships throughout the Celtic world. The genealogies preserved in manuscripts like the Harleian Collection and the Jesus College MS 20 trace detailed kinship connections between contemporary Welsh nobles and legendary figures from Rheged, Strathclyde, and the Gododdin territories. While the historical accuracy of these genealogical claims cannot be verified through archaeological evidence, their consistent preservation across multiple manuscript traditions suggests that they reflected genuine cultural memories of political relationships and territorial connections that had survived the collapse of the original kingdoms. The linguistic legacy of the northern British kingdoms persisted in the place name evidence that preserved Cumbric and early Welsh terminology throughout southern Scotland and northern England long after the disappearance of native speakers. The survival of British place names in areas that had been under Anglo-Saxon political control for centuries demonstrates the persistence of indigenous geographical knowledge and local cultural traditions despite demographic and political changes. Archaeological investigations guided by place name evidence have successfully identified numerous sites associated with the northern British kingdoms, including hill forts, royal centres, and ecclesiastical establishments that might otherwise have remained unrecognised. The ecclesiastical traditions that developed from the Christian communities of Hen Ogledd continue to influence religious practice throughout the medieval Celtic world, particularly through the veneration of saints associated with the northern British kingdoms. Saint Kentigern of Strathclyde became the patron saint of Glasgow, with his cult centre at Govan serving as a focus for regional religious identity that transcended political boundaries. Archaeological investigations at early Christian sites throughout the former territories of the northern kingdoms reveal continuity in religious practice and architectural traditions that preserved elements of Celtic Christianity, despite the introduction of continental European religious reforms. The material culture associated with the northern British kingdoms influenced artistic and craft traditions throughout the medieval Celtic world, particularly in the production of metalwork, stone sculpture, and manuscript illumination. The distinctive artistic styles that had developed in Hen Ogledd during the 6th and 7th centuries continued to influence Celtic artistic production for centuries after the political collapse of the original kingdoms. Archaeological analysis of medieval metalwork from Wales, Ireland and Scotland reveals the persistence of decorative motifs and technical approaches that can be traced back to workshops in Rhayaget, Strathclyde and other northern British centres. The legal traditions that had governed social relationships in the northern British kingdoms contributed to the development of medieval Celtic law codes that preserved elements of ancient customary practice within Christianised legal frameworks. The laws attributed to ULDDA in 10th century Wales incorporate certain principles and procedures that appear to derive from earlier British legal traditions, though the specific connections to northern British practice cannot be definitively established through available sources. Archaeological evidence from legal assembly sites throughout the Celtic world reveals continuity in judicial procedures and ceremonial practices that suggest the preservation of ancient legal traditions despite political and religious changes. The military traditions associated with the warrior culture of Hen Ogledd influenced medieval Celtic concepts of nobility and martial honour that shaped aristocratic behaviour throughout the region for centuries. The emphasis on personal valour, loyalty to kinship groups, and the pursuit of honourable reputation that characterised the warrior bands of Rhayaget and Strathclyde continued to define aristocratic ideals in medieval Wales, Ireland and Scotland. Archaeological evidence from medieval castle sites and noble residences reveals the persistence of ceremonial practices and material culture associated with warrior identity, including the deposition of weapons in graves and the construction of halls designed to accommodate military retinues. The agricultural and economic systems that had supported the northern British kingdoms provided models for rural organisation and resource management that influenced medieval development throughout northern Britain. The field systems and settlement patterns established during the period of British political independence continued to shape land use and agricultural practice long after the territories had been incorporated into Anglo-Saxon or Scottish kingdoms. Archaeological surveys of rural landscapes throughout the region reveal remarkable continuity in farming techniques and settlement organisation that preserved efficient adaptations to local environmental conditions. The technological innovations that had been developed in the northern British kingdoms, particularly in metallurgy and fortification engineering, contributed to broader medieval technological development throughout the Celtic world. The advanced iron-working techniques employed in royal workshops at Carlisle and Dumbarton Rock influenced metalworking traditions throughout northern Britain, while the sophisticated defensive systems developed for hill fort fortification provided models for medieval castle construction. Archaeological analysis of medieval fortifications reveals the incorporation of design principles and construction techniques that can be traced back to the engineering traditions of Hen Ogledd. Modern archaeological and historical research has fundamentally transformed scholarly understanding of the northern British kingdoms and their significance in early medieval European history. The systematic excavation of major sites like Dumbarton Rock, Traprain Law and Carlisle has revealed the sophisticated political organisation and material culture that characterised these realms, challenging earlier assumptions about the decline of British civilization following the end of Roman rule. The application of scientific dating techniques and environmental archaeology has provided precise chronological frameworks and detailed reconstructions of economic and social systems that demonstrate the complexity and achievement of northern British society. The interdisciplinary approaches that characterise contemporary scholarship on Hen Ogledd combine archaeological evidence with linguistic analysis, historical documentation, and scientific investigation to create comprehensive pictures of early medieval northern British society. The collaboration between archaeologists, historians, linguists, and environmental scientists has produced new insights into political organisation, economic systems, religious practice, and cultural identity that would have been impossible to achieve through any single methodological approach. The development of digital databases and geographic information systems has enabled researchers to analyse spatial relationships and temporal changes across the entire region of the Northern British Kingdoms. The international context of research on the Northern British Kingdoms has revealed their significance within broader patterns of post-Roman political development throughout Western Europe. Comparative studies with contemporary kingdoms in Ireland, Wales, Brittany, and continental Europe have demonstrated that Hen Ogledd participated in cultural and political developments that extended far beyond the immediate British Isles. The archaeological evidence for long-distance trade connections and diplomatic relationships shows that the northern British kingdoms were integrated into European-wide networks of exchange and communication that connected them with political and cultural developments throughout the former Roman Empire. The legacy of Hen Ogledd in shaping the cultural and political landscape of medieval Britain extends far beyond the preservation of romantic memories to encompass fundamental contributions to the development of Scottish, Welsh, and English national identities. The territorial boundaries, administrative systems, and cultural traditions established by the northern British kingdoms influenced political development throughout the region for centuries after their political independence had ended. The synthesis of Celtic and Anglo-Saxon traditions that occurred in the borderlands between British and Germanic territories created hybrid cultures that contributed to the distinctive characteristics of medieval Northern English and Southern Scottish society. The scholarly recognition of Hen Ogledd's historical significance has encouraged new research initiatives and public engagement programs that seek to preserve and interpret the archaeological and cultural heritage associated with the northern British kingdoms. Museums throughout Scotland, northern England and Wales have developed exhibitions and educational programs that present current understanding of these societies to public audiences, while heritage organisations work to protect important archaeological sites from development pressures and environmental degradation. The growing popular interest in early medieval Celtic history has created opportunities for scholarly research and cultural preservation that ensure the continued study and appreciation of this crucial period in British history. The story of Hen Ogledd ultimately represents one of the most significant yet underappreciated chapters in the formation of medieval Britain, demonstrating the sophisticated political, cultural, and economic achievements of post-Roman Celtic society, while revealing the complex processes of cultural adaptation and survival that shaped the development of modern British identity. The northern British kingdoms created lasting legacies in literature, law, religion, and political organisation that continue to influence British and European development long after their political independence had ended, ensuring that the memory of the Old North would endure as an integral part of the cultural heritage that defines the British Isles.